Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man! We now come, if there are no further points of order, thank you. We now come to the general debate on national security and Russia. I call the Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I beg to move the motion on the order paper standing in my name. 3 weeks ago, the Russian Federation was responsible for an attempted murder here in our country. This was not only a crime against Sergei and Yulia Skripal, it was an indiscriminate and reckless act against the United Kingdom, putting the lives of innocent civilians at risk. It was an assault on our fundamental values and the rules-based international system that upholds them. And it was part of a pattern of increasingly aggressive Russian behaviour, but which, with the first offensive use of a nerve agent on European soil since the foundation of NATO, also represents a new and dangerous phase in Russia's hostile activity within our continent and beyond. So this debate is taking place, Mr. Speaker, because there is no greater responsibility for this House, for this government and for me as Prime Minister, than recognising threats to our national security and acting to meet them. So let me set out for the House what we now know about the recklessness of this act and its exposure of innocent people to potential harm, the evidence that Russia was indeed responsible, the wider pattern of Russia's illegal and destabilising actions within our continent and beyond, the extensive actions this government has already been taking, and our determination to work with our international partners to confront the evolving nature of this threat, to defend the rules-based international system and to keep our people safe. Mr. Speaker, let me start by updating the House on the situation in Salisbury. Sergei and Yulia Skripal remain critically ill in hospital. Sadly, late last week, doctors indicated that their condition is unlikely to change in the near future, and they may never recover fully. This shows the utterly barbaric nature of this act and the dangers that hundreds of innocent citizens in Salisbury could have faced. An investigation continues into all the locations where the Skripals had been present on Sunday the 4th of March. As a result, we now have a fuller picture of the recklessness of this act against our country. While Public Health England have made clear that the risk to public health is low, and this remains the case, we assess that more than 130 people in Salisbury could have been potentially exposed to this nerve agent. More than 50 people were assessed in hospital, with Detective Sergeant Nick Bailey taken seriously ill. I know everyone in the House will welcome the news that he has been discharged and continue, as we said earlier, to hold him and his family in our thoughts as he makes his recovery. Mr. Speaker, we are quite clear that Russia was responsible for this act. As I set out for the House in my statements earlier this month, our world-leading experts at the Defence Science and Technology Laboratory at Porton Down positively identified the chemical used for this act as a Novichok, a military-grade nerve agent of a type developed by the Soviet Union. We know that Russia has a record of conducting state-sponsored assassinations and that it views some former intelligence officers as legitimate targets for these assassinations. And we have information indicating that within the last decade, Russia has investigated ways of delivering nerve agents, probably for assassination, and as part of this programme has produced and stockpiled small quantities of Novichoks. Clearly, that is in contravention of the Chemical Weapons Convention, and so it is right that we have been working closely with the Organisation for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, whose team arrived in the UK last week and collected samples. This is a normal part of us discharging our obligations under the Convention, although we are clear as to what the evidence is. As a permanent member of the UN Security Council, upholding these non-proliferation regimes with our partners is central to our international security, while Russia has recklessly undermined and violated them. In conclusion, as I've set out, no other country has a combination of the capability, the intent and the motive to carry out such an act. There is no other plausible explanation, and that is not just the view of the UK government. It was the unanimous view of every single leader at last week's European Council, and the view of our allies in NATO and around the world. Mr. Speaker, I know there are some who question whether there could be alternative explanations. So let me be absolutely clear, we have been led by evidence, not by speculation. And when faced with the evidence, we gave the Russian government the opportunity to provide an explanation, but they did not do so. They provided no explanation as to why Russia has an undeclared chemical weapons program in contravention of international law. No explanation that could suggest they had lost control of their nerve agent, and no explanation as to how this agent came to be used in the United Kingdom. Instead, they have treated the use of a military-grade nerve agent in Europe with sarcasm, contempt, and defiance. Incredibly, they have deployed at least 21 different arguments about it. They have suggested that they never produced Novichoks, or that they produced them but then destroyed them. They've tried to claim that their agents are not covered by the Chemical Weapons Convention. They have pointed the finger at other countries, including Slovakia, Sweden, and the Czech Republic, and even tried to claim that the United Kingdom was responsible for a chemical attack on our own citizens. For a nation-state like Russia to resort again to peddling such preposterous and contradictory theories is unworthy of their people and their great history.
Cabinet ministers in this House defended Russia despite the growing evidence of the enormity of its crimes from 1929 to 1931. At least that was understandable on the basis of a shared ideology. Now that the Soviet Union, Russia has abandoned that ideology, to what can she attribute the reluctance of the right honourable gentleman opposite to point the finger where it properly lies?
To my right honourable friend, I can find no reason to attribute to the right honourable gentleman opposite for the stance that he's previously taken on this issue, and I hope that, as some of his other honourable and right honourable friends have done, that he will be taking a different position in the debate today. As I said, to peddle such preposterous theories is unworthy of the Russian people. It's merely an effort to distract from the truth of Russia's violation of international law. And this unlawful use of force by the Russian state against the United Kingdom is a clear violation of the Chemical Weapons Convention and a breach of the UN Charter. This act against our country is the latest in a pattern of increasingly aggressive Russian behaviour, attacking the international rules-based system across our continent and beyond. Russia's illegal actions in Crimea were the first time since the Second World War that one sovereign nation has forcibly annexed territory from another in Europe. Since then, Russia has fomented conflict in the Donbass, repeatedly violated the national airspace of several European countries, and mounted a sustained campaign of cyber espionage and disruption.
I'm very grateful for her for giving way. She will know that the 2015 SDSR states that state-on-state threats have dramatically reduced. But given what she's just said and given what we all know, can she tell us if the Modernising Defence Programme will seek to update that part that underpins the SDSR?
Say to the honourable gentleman that we have been looking at the overall question of the threats for national security. We do that within the National Security Capability Review. Of course, the Modernising Defence Programme has come out of that, and the Modernising Defence Programme will look at the threats that we face and the capabilities that we need to have in relation to that. But that will, of course, be set in that wider context of the overall national security capabilities that we need to defend ourselves in the future.
To the Prime Minister. She will know that since General Gerasimov updated the playbook of Russian active measures, intervention in democracy abroad has been one of the mainstays of Russian activity around the world. Our national security strategy does not include an explicit objective to defend the integrity of our democracy. And our election law defences are hopelessly out of date. Will she now bring forward an update to that national security strategy and, crucially, update the election law so our regulators have the power to keep our democracy safe?
Very good.
Well, gentlemen, we take very seriously the need to ensure that we keep our democracy safe and that we have free and fair elections at all times in this country. And he is right, as I was about to go on to say. We know that Russia has meddled in elections elsewhere. We do look at and are updating the arrangements in terms of electoral law in a number of ways. But I think it is absolutely right, as I said, that we have updated the national security issues. We did that, responded to the terrorist attacks that we saw here in the United Kingdom last year in setting up the National Security Capability Review. But that review and, of course, the Modernising Defence Programme will look overall at the threats that we face
I thank the Prime Minister for giving way. After Georgia, the Crimea, the Ukraine, Alexander Litvinenko, and now Salisbury, I believe that we are entering, if not a period of Cold War, at least a period of cool war in our relations with Russia, which is likely to last for some time. In that context, would she agree with me that the robust decision of 18 of our allies to expel Russian diplomats is likely to give them pause for thought and will hurt them far more than our unilateral expulsions in 1971?
Can I say to my honourable friend, I believe he's absolutely right. Those expulsions have taken place, I believe, in the national, as I said earlier in this chamber, not just as a sign of support for the United Kingdom, but actually because it's important for the national security of those countries concerned. I believe it will have an impact. The expulsion of 23 undeclared intelligence officers, which we have already undertaken here in the United Kingdom, will have a major impact on their intelligence network here in the United Kingdom, as I will come on to reference later. I've said a little earlier that, of course, Russia has meddled in elections. It's hacked the Danish Ministry of Defence and the Bundestag, among many others. It's seeking to weaponise information, deploying its state-run media organisations to plant fake stories and photoshopped images in an attempt to sow discord in the West and undermine our institutions. During his recent State of the Union address, President Putin showed video graphics of missile launches, flight trajectories and explosions, including the modelling of attacks on the United States, with a series of warheads impacting in Florida. And of course, Russia used radiological substances in its despicable assault here in London on Mr. Litvinenko. I'll just make the sentence and I'll go. Russia is also failing to honour its responsibilities in the international community as a permanent member of the UN Security Council. I give way to the Honourable Lady.
I thank the Prime Minister for giving way. At the NATO Parliamentary Assembly this weekend, the Honourable Member for Newbury issued a statement to members of the Parliamentary Assembly, and we had total 100% support from all of the NATO alliance parliamentarians for what happened and our stance in relation to the blaming of Russia. But one question was raised, and that was a concern from some of the members that Britain has very good CRBN capability to investigate, and many of them wouldn't if it had happened on their soil. Would the Prime Minister agree that we would, should another NATO ally be attacked in this way, that we would provide them with the capability that we have, that we've demonstrated so well?
Well, the Honourable Lady raises a very important point, and I will respond in a number of ways. First of all, it's clear from the EU Council that we'll be looking within the EU at the whole question of enhancing our ability to deal with CBRN and potential CBRN attacks. But the issue for that wider group of countries that the Honourable Lady has referred to, I understand that the NATO summit this summer will be looking at this question of sharing capabilities, because we recognise there are certain capabilities and certain expertise held in certain countries, and of course it is important that that is able to be put to the use of others when it's necessary to do so.
Yes. To the Prime Minister, whilst the improvements at DSTL Porton Down are very welcome, would you agree with me that the abolition of the CBRN Joint Regiment in 2011, in the light of current events, appears to be premature, and will she, as part of the Defence Review, consider rebuilding that facility?
Well, can I say to my honourable friend, the important issue is the capabilities that we retain. Those capabilities may be retained in a slightly different format and in a slightly different way, but we do continue to have excellent CBRN capabilities across our national security structure as a whole. Mr. Speaker, I said that Russia was failing to honour its responsibilities as a permanent member of the UN Security Council. In particular, Russia has covered up for the Assad regime's use of chemical weapons in Syria, especially in its attempts to impede the OPCW's joint investigative mechanism. This has allowed the Syrian regime to continue to perpetrate atrocities against the Syrian people. For the last month, in contravention of UNSCR 2401, Russian air power and military coordination has enabled the regime offensive in eastern Ghouta causing more appalling suffering and impeding the heroic efforts of the humanitarian relief agencies. Indeed, over the course of many years of civil war, hundreds of thousands of Syrians have died, and many times that number have been displaced. Yet Russia has repeatedly failed to use its influence over the Syrian regime to bring an end to this terrible suffering. Mr. Speaker, from the outset, the UK has been at the forefront of the European and transatlantic response to these actions. In response to the annexation of Crimea, we led the work with our EU and G7 partners in constructing the first sanctions regime against Russia. We have stepped up our military and economic support to Ukraine, including directly training almost 7,000 Ukrainian armed forces personnel. We are the second largest contributor of monitors to the OSCE Special Monitoring Mission. We are driving reform of NATO to better deter and counter hostile Russian activity, and our commitment to collective defence and security through NATO remains as strong as ever. Indeed, our armed forces have a leading role in NATO's enhanced forward presence, with British troops leading a multinational battle group in Estonia. In the Western Balkans, we stepped up our support to our newest ally, Montenegro, when it suffered an attempt by Russia to stage a coup. While our Western Balkans summit in July will enhance our security cooperation, in just a moment I will give way, will enhance our security cooperation with all our Western Balkans partners, including on serious and organised crime, anti-corruption and cyber security. I give way to my honourable friend.
Concerned that, as much as I am and other people in this House, that the Russians appear to be rearming various Serb groups in the Balkans, and what does she consider, or why does she consider the Russians are rearming Serbian groups in the Balkans, as well as doing other things like handing out Russian passports? Thank you.
Well, can I say to my honourable friend, I know the particular knowledge and expertise he has on these matters. I think I would say that this is part of that pattern of Russian behaviour, which is increasingly aggressive behaviour, to sow foment and to sow discord in a number of countries around Europe. I believe that the Western Balkan Summit will be an important opportunity for us as a country, as part of the Berlin process on those summits, to help to work to enhance our security cooperation with our Western Balkans partners. I will give way to the honourable gentleman.
Mr. McGivern, thank you for our speech to the House today. Does the Prime Minister agree that whilst a functioning relationship is needed with the Russians, and the basis of that relationship has to be the foundation of respect, which was and is seriously lacking in the murderous attack by Russia on our country and indeed across the whole of Europe?
Prime Minister.
Mutual respect. Yes. Well, can I say to the honourable gentleman that I think we need to ensure, as I've said earlier, in terms of our relations with Russia, we have no problem with the Russian people, and they have a great history, but it is the actions of the current Russian regime that are of concern to us. And I think many of us had hoped that at the breakup of the Soviet Union we would see a different type of approach being taken by Russia, but sadly that has not proved to be the case. I will just give way to the honourable lady and then make progress.
I thank the Prime Minister for being very generous with her interventions. What assessment has the government made of other approaches? For example, the British Council did do excellent work in Moscow. What's her view now of that work that will not continue because of the expulsion?
Prime Minister.
Well, the honourable lady is right. The British Council did do extremely good work, and of course, as she will know, the Russians have taken action against the British Council. I'll come on in a few minutes to mention one or two other things that might be of interest to her in that sense. We are building up our defences against Russia's cyber threat more broadly, investing almost £2 billion in our national cyber security strategy, and have opened a new National Cyber Security Centre, which is actively working with international partners, industry and civil society to tackle this threat. We're also working with our European partners to support the Centre of Excellence for countering hybrid threats in Helsinki. We're calling out Russia's malign behaviour in cyberspace, as we did last month when, together with the US and other allies, we attributed the NotPetya cyber attack to the Russian military. And we're investing millions in countering Russian disinformation efforts, including more investment in public service and independent media operating in the Russian language, both through projects in the Baltic states, Ukraine, Moldova and Georgia, and through reinvigorating the BBC Russia service as an independent source of news for Russian speakers. I will give way a final time.
I thank the Prime Minister very much for giving way. She is very generous. On that note, given that the misinformation being spread by Russian television stations and stations they got a hand in, would this not be a good time potentially to increase our funding of the World Service television output, because we can give our own correct and democratic messages?
And the monitoring.
Minister, can I say to thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, can I say to my honourable friend that we do, of course, look at the resources that are provided to the BBC World Service. Obviously, the BBC World Television is on a slightly different basis, but I think what is important is that we do reinvigorate the BBC Russia service. I think this can provide a very important independent source of news for Russian speakers. As the House knows, we already have the largest defence budget in Europe and second largest in NATO, meeting the 2% standard and set to increase every year of this Parliament. We've also commissioned, as I've made reference previously, the National Security Capability Review, which will report shortly, and the Modernising Defence Programme, to ensure that our defence and security capabilities are optimised to address the threats we face, including those from Russia. Following the incident in Salisbury, we have, of course, taken further measures. We are dismantling the Russian espionage network in our country, and we will not allow it to be rebuilt. We are urgently developing proposals for new legislative powers to harden our defences against all forms of hostile state activity. This will include the addition of a targeted power to detain those suspected of such activity at the UK border, and considering whether there is a need for new counter-espionage powers to clamp down on the full spectrum of hostile activities of foreign agents in our country. We are making full use of existing powers to enhance our efforts to monitor and track the intentions of those travelling to the UK who could be engaged in activity that threatens the security of the UK and our allies. This includes, if my honourable friend will just give me 1 minute, a little more detail here. This includes increasing checks on private flights, customs and freight, and freezing Russian state assets wherever we have the evidence that they may be used to threaten the life or property of UK nationals or residents. Give way.
I'm very grateful for the position the Prime Minister is laying out, and she has my wholehearted support, particularly on private flights, an area that covers many sins. Could she also perhaps talk a little bit about the media here, because there are some media organisations who are acting as state assets, even though they're claiming independence, and they are not journalists at all, but they are agents of propaganda and information warfare.
Prime Minister. As my honourable friend will, I'm sure, know, the question of whether there are certain media outlets operating, such as broadcasters operating here in the UK, and the licence under which they operate is a matter for Ofcom as an independent body. We are also cracking down on illicit and corrupt finance, bringing all the capabilities of UK law enforcement to bear against serious criminals and corrupt elites, neither of whom have any place in our country. I will give way to the honourable.
She knew I was going to come in the moment she mentioned finance, but can I just suggest two things that she could do, which I think would make a dramatic difference, and so far the government has been reluctant to do. The first is a full review of the Tier 1 investor visa, whereby £2 million just has to be handed over and it isn't necessarily checked so as to get residency rights in the UK. And the second is making sure that the trust register of beneficial ownership of trusts, which many Russians use to hide their finances in this country, is public.
Hear, hear. Prime Minister. Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I say to the right honourable gentleman that, as I indicated in the previous debate on the statement, it is the case that my right honourable friend, the Home Secretary, is looking at the question of that Tier 1 visa, investor visa, and its operation. Obviously, he refers to some of the specific work that we've been doing. As he will know, we have already taken some steps and are taking steps that are world-leading, I think, in relation to some of the registers and the transparency of those registers, particularly, obviously, in relation to property. And, of course, we continue to look at what steps we can, any further steps that we can take in this area. But we have, as my, I would like to make just a little more progress before the point. We've given our law enforcement agencies new powers in the Criminal Finance Act, and we'll table an amendment to the Sanctions Bill to ensure that the UK cannot be a home for those who trade illicit finance or commit human rights abuses. And crucially, Madam Deputy Speaker, because this threat from Russia is an attack on the whole international rules-based system and the collective security of the UK and its allies, so we must continue to work closely with all our international partners. That includes through the new security partnership we want to build with the European Union as part of our new relationship after we've left. And as I said in my speech in Munich, when we leave the EU, it's right that the UK will pursue an independent foreign policy, but around the world, the interests that we will seek to project and defend will continue to be rooted in our shared values. And nowhere is this more true than in standing up to Russia's hostile actions and refuting its attempts to undermine the international rules-based order. As President Macron said on Friday, Russia's actions in Salisbury were an act of aggression against the sovereignty of an ally which demands a reaction. As I set out in my statement earlier, the EU and its member states have already taken some immediate actions, including withdrawing the EU's ambassador from Moscow, and as I announced today, 18 countries have announced their intention to expel more than 100 Russian intelligence officers, including 15 EU member states, as well as the US, Canada and the Ukraine. And I repeat, as I said earlier, this is the largest collective expulsion of Russian intelligence officers in history. Mr. Speaker, Madam Deputy Speaker, I do apologise, Madam Deputy Speaker, if the Kremlin's goal is to divide and intimidate the Western alliance, then their efforts have spectacularly backfired. Today's actions by our allies clearly demonstrate that we all stand shoulder to shoulder in sending the strongest signal to the Kremlin that Russia cannot continue to flout international law and threaten our security. As I argued at last week's European Council, we must reappraise how our collective efforts can best tackle the challenge that Russia poses. But we must and will proceed on a rigorous and legally sound basis, which is why the Council mandated foreign ministers to consider how best to proceed and to report back ahead of the next Council.
Would the Prime Minister give given the catalogue of outrages which the Prime Minister has outlined, could the Prime Minister confirm to the House that the measures to be considered by foreign ministers in due course will include the possibility of sanctions either against the wider Russian economy or against particular individuals close to the Putin regime?
Prime Minister, I say to my honourable friend that we have asked foreign ministers to look at what steps they think it is important for us to take. We, as the UK, have already been at the forefront of the economic sanctions that have been put in place in relation to Russia following the illegal annexation of Crimea. And, of course, the EU Council will want to be looking at those sanctions for the future. I will give way to my right honourable.
I'm most grateful to my right honourable friend, and I agree entirely with the approach she's adopted. She highlighted the absolute need that our response had in fact to be lawful. And does she agree that that is why the collective response which is achieved across our allies is going to be so important? Because otherwise the temptation will always be that we can't resist this kind of unlawful assault without resorting to methods of our own, which would be unacceptable, and why the alliance that she's forged on this appears to me to be of the greatest possible importance for us.
Prime Minister, I say to my right honourable learned friend, I think he is absolutely right that the alliance, and both in the strength of the signal that it sends, but also in the very clear message that we are not resorting to the sort of, as he says, the unlawful methods. We are actually acting in full sight, and we're acting in accordance with the law. Madam Deputy Speaker, as I've made clear before, we have no disagreement with the Russian people who have achieved so much through their country's great history. Indeed, our thoughts are with them today, and especially the friends and families of those who died in that awful shopping centre fire in Kemerovo in Siberia. Neither should we wish to be in a permanent state of perpetual confrontation with Russia. Many of us, as I've just said in answer to an intervention, many of us looked at a post-Soviet Russia with hope. We would much rather have in Russia a constructive partner ready to play by the rules. But while we should continue to keep open this possibility, we must also face the facts. President Putin's regime is carrying out acts of aggression against our values and interests within Europe and beyond. The challenge of Russia is one that will endure for years to come. As a European democracy, the United Kingdom will stand shoulder to shoulder with our allies in the European Union and NATO to face down these threats together. We will defend our infrastructure, our institutions and our values against attempts to undermine them, and we will act to protect our national security and to keep our people safe. And I commend this motion to the House.
The question is that this House has considered national security and Russia. Mr. Jeremy Corbyn.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. We must start with the events in Salisbury. What happened to Sergei and Yulia Skripal on March the 4th was an outrageous act, committed with callous indifference towards the wider community in Salisbury, including those brave police officers who had to respond and investigate the incident. Our first thoughts must remain with Mr. Skripal and his daughter as they continue to fight for their lives in an NHS hospital, and with Detective Sergeant Nick Bradley as he continues his recovery. Based on the analysis conducted by government scientists, there can be little doubt that the nerve agent used in this attack was military-grade Novichok of a type manufactured by Russia. Since that analysis was revealed by the Prime Minister 2 weeks ago, the Russian state has had every opportunity to offer a plausible explanation as to how a nerve agent stock of this type came to be used in this attack. They've offered nothing concrete in response except denials and diversion. Indeed, the only solid assertion that they've offered so far in their defence was that all stocks of nerve agents were destroyed many years ago, an assertion that has been contradicted by intelligence reports. That suggests that just over a decade ago, Russia invested in the use of nerve agents and developed new stockpiles of Novichok to that end. There is clear evidence that the Russian state has a case to answer and that they have failed to do so, and we can therefore draw no other conclusion other than Russia has a direct or indirect responsibility for this. Mr. Speaker, we have supported actions taken and condemn the Russian government for including it in their tit-for-tat retaliation, a totally unnecessary and counterproductive decision to close the British Council offices in Russia, which have done so much to promote better understanding and closer relationships between our two countries. It's a matter of deep regret to all of us that on issue after issue, and not of our making, UK-Russian relations now stand at such a low ebb.
To the Leader of the Opposition for giving way. He has condemned Russia's retaliation. What he has not done yet, clearly and unequivocally, is condemned the attempted murders themselves. Will he now take this opportunity without further caveat to absolutely condemn the Russian government's involvement in these attempted murders?
Mr. Corbyn.
Mr. Speaker, I've very clearly condemned what happened and very clearly condemned those that were perpetrated this attack. On the 14th of March, the Prime Minister said there are other measures we stand ready to deploy at any time should we face further provocation. Does the Prime Minister consider the expulsion of 23 British diplomats and the closure of the British Council as a further provocation? On Russian citizens here, in the light of the poisonings of the Skripals and the murder of Nikolai Glushkov, what advice and support are the police and security services giving to high-profile Russians living in Britain, or indeed any other Russian national living and working within this country? On one element of the government's response, can I ask the Prime Minister what plans she has to publish and table the government's version of Labour's Magnitsky Amendment to the Sanctions Bill, which was blocked in February? We've been assured that this will deliver all the powers that we were demanding and my friend, the Shadow Chancellor, was demanding in his response to the budget and the finance bill. Even before the Salisbury attack, to punish Russian abusers of human rights. We are still waiting to see it published.
The United Kingdom will want to know, does he hold the Russian government responsible for this, yes or no?
I've already made that very clear, and what I was asking was for a clear commitment from the government that the Magnitsky powers will be introduced and will be supported by members on the benches opposite. And in that same spirit, can I also urge the government to look again at Labour's proposal to target the laundering of money through secret tax havens and undisclosed assets, as practised by many of the London-based Russian oligarchs, on whom so much of Putin's power depends. Okay, last time.
I'd like to thank the member for giving way, because I'm trying to listen very hard to what he says. Can he confirm that he agrees that there is no other plausible explanation other than the Russian state being responsible for the chemical attack on British soil? The Russian state being responsible.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I made it very clear earlier in the speech what my position was, and I wonder, and I hope it's not the case, that the honourable lady...
Order. We can't have both sides of the House shouting at the Leader of the Opposition. He must be heard. Mr Corbyn.
Mr Speaker, I hope the honourable lady isn't trying to divert us away from a discussion about oligarchs' money in London and the need for a Magnitsky amendment.
Madam Deputy Speaker, before more Conservative MPs stand up in this chamber and ask their pre-prepared questions, they should listen again to what my right honourable friend said in his opening remarks. He said that given the failure of the Russian state for the past 2 weeks to provide any evidence to the contrary, he accepts that the Russian state was responsible for the Salisbury chemical weapons attack. End of story.
I thank my friend for his intervention and for the very serious and close interest he takes in all these matters. I was talking about Russian-based oligarchs and their power because, as the Prime Minister will know, it's not just the Labour Party pressing for action, but Alexei Navalny, a Russian opposition party leader who was barred from standing for the Russian presidency, who has faced down intimidation that he, his family and supporters have faced at the hands of the Russian state, and has made clear that the most important thing the UK could do would be to curb the power, punish the actions of Vladimir Putin, is to hit his billionaire allies in their pockets. So I hope the Prime Minister will listen to that advice.
A lot of people out there who are very grateful that he has called on the government to follow due diligence and called on to follow the guidelines set out for the Organisation for the Prevention of Chemical Weapons. And has he noticed that they've quietly heeded his advice?
Indeed, Madam Deputy Speaker, I thank my honourable friend for his intervention, and I will be discussing the issues of that organisation a little bit further on in my speech. So, in turning to welcoming the expressions of cooperation and solidarity for our international allies, including the withdrawal of the EU ambassador to Moscow and the coordinated expulsion of Russian diplomats, we must continue to build further concrete multilateral actions to send a clear message that the Russians' actions are not acceptable. As I said previously, it's by building alliances we strengthen our approach and the action we take. So, to that end, Madam Deputy Speaker, we applaud the government's decision, as we proposed 2 weeks ago, to ask the Organisation for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons to conduct its own independent analysis of the nerve agent used in the attack, to verify the tests conducted here in Britain. We are certain that those results may not be different.
Order. The right honourable gentleman will give way when he decides to do so. Mr Corbyn.
Thank you. But we hope it will make it easier for the government to strengthen the resolve of our allies around the world to strengthen the coordinated response. To that end, I wonder if the Prime Minister could tell us later, when does she expect Well, then the Foreign Secretary will be in a position to reply to us with his normal due diligence and care about the results of the OPCW tests that are being undertaken at the moment, and so he can write it down. If he could give us the answer later on this evening, after my honourable friend has spoken, I'd be very grateful. And would he also agree with me that this attack serves as a stark reminder of how important it is to properly enforce the Chemical Weapons Convention and to ensure the OPCW has all the necessary support it needs, both political and financial, to do its job effectively? Yes.
I'm very grateful. I commend the Leader of the Opposition on what he said earlier today. Isn't one of the horrible ironies of the way that the Russians have done their business over recent years that they've sought the soft underbelly of British society, the strengths of fair play and the rule of law and all the rest, to try and target the way we do our business in this country? Surely, I met with Marina Litvinenko last week, and she said to me, you know, one of the most sensible things you could do if you can't get to a proper trial, which is what we'd all want to have, is some kind of judicial inquiry into the events in Salisbury. Does my right honourable friend support that?
Jeremy Corbyn.
I think that's a very helpful suggestion, Madam Deputy Speaker. And again, my friend has taken a very long-term and very serious interest in the issues of human rights in Russia and about the large sums of Russian money that have turned up, particularly in London. My question was, I'll come to you one second, my question was, Madam Deputy Speaker, to the Foreign Secretary when he replies what the government is doing through the United Nations to make sure that the OPCW has the resources and support that it needs.
Sit down. Don't let him.
Would my honourable agree with my honourable... Would my honourable friend agree with members of my constituency who have expressed concerns about the fact that significant sums of elite Russian money are donated to their party in exchange for political influence, including, we understand, a lot of money for a game of tennis with one of the members opposite?
Jeremy Corbyn.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I understand it was an incredibly expensive game of tennis with the Foreign Secretary. All I can say is I'm not going to bid for a game of tennis with the Foreign Secretary at all. On the response to Salisbury, Mr. Speaker, it seems a matter of fact, as well as violating international law on the use of chemical weapons, the Salisbury attack also represented extraterritorial violations of human rights. So can I ask the government whether they've considered initiating or supporting a case in the European Court of Human Rights to examine this, as has been called for by a number of members? Let me turn from the Salisbury attack to wider security issues raised by these actions. And it's striking, Mr. Speaker, how far we've come in the past 2 years, not just in understanding the threat of cyber warfare, but also in experiencing its reality. In the last 2 years, we've seen these dangers proven to us. We've seen Russia, amongst others, using social media to disseminate fake news in this country and disrupt the democratic process. And we've seen the attempt to interfere in our, according to the Foreign Secretary, without any success. And in the WannaCry attack on the NHS computer network in May of last year, we saw the ability of overseas hackers, in that case it was blamed on North Korea, to paralyse critical UK public services and infrastructure. They need the resources to be able to defend their systems and their services. These are developments which fundamentally challenge traditional definitions and norms of conflict. And whether we can adequately respond to these challenges is likely to be the crucial test of our defence policies in this country. On that note, while I know the Prime Minister will not want to go into detail, will she at least reassure us later not just that preventive measures and contingency plans are in place across our critical national infrastructure, but that simulation exercises have been conducted across all key sectors to test the state of readiness and identify any required improvements? NHS and many, many other services depend on computer systems that can be hacked into with all the obvious dangers to everyone's normal lives. Let me turn to the threat to Britain, the threat posed to allies in NATO, Eastern Europe and the security of the world as a result of rising tensions in recent years. Now more than ever, it's vital we stress to our European counterparts that their support is important in the wake of the Salisbury attack, and that we wish to work with them to maximise the power of collective sanctions against violations of international law, whether from Russia or any other state, and that our commitment to collective action will not be diminished by Brexit. And similarly, Madam Deputy Speaker, now more than ever, it's also vital that the UK and all other members make it clear to all our allies in Baltic states and elsewhere that we want to protect peace and security on the borders without ramping up tensions unnecessarily, and that it is not a commitment conditional on their levels of defence spending. At the same time, it does us all well to listen to the words of the outgoing chair of the NATO Military Committee, General Petr Pavel, who, whilst a fierce critic of Russia's actions in Ukraine, also made clear early this month that during the tensions of recent years, the only incursions of Russian planes into NATO airspace or vice versa have occurred because of human error, making it all the more vital that channels of communication— I'm quoting the outgoing chair of the NATO Defence Committee, making it all the more vital, Madam Deputy Speaker, that channels of communication remain open to avoid tensions rising unnecessarily as a result of misunderstandings. And more broadly, Madam Deputy Speaker, General Pavel stressed how vital it was to maintain, and I quote, a constructive dialogue between NATO and Russia. 2 weeks ago, I said I favoured a robust dialogue. Mr. Speaker, I've been a robust critic of the actions of the Russian government for more than 20 years. I was opposing, Madam Deputy Speaker, the abuse that was going on in Chechnya by Russian forces, the manipulation of elections, the oppression of LGBT rights, and the dodgy laundering by Russian oligarchs of money through London.
I thank my right honourable friend for giving way, and I was not intending to intervene in this, but I cannot actually let that remark go by. I've sat here reading his article in the Morning Star after Russia annexed part of Ukraine, where the strongest criticism he makes there is, on Ukraine, I would not condone Russian behaviour or expansion, but it is not unprovoked. And then into the usual criticism of the US and NATO and UK policy. It's just not true, Madam Deputy Speaker.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I thank my honourable friend for his usual helpful intervention. Thank you very much. But we
Order! The Leader of the Opposition must be heard. Questions have been asked of him, and he will now answer them. Mr. Corbyn.
Abuses of human rights anywhere in the world are wrong, and on a delegation to Moscow with members of the all-party human rights group at the time of the starting of Russia and the end of the Soviet Union, a whole group of us made it very, very clear across party lines what we thought about attacks on LGBT people, about what was going on in Chechnya, and about the denial of the rights of civil assembly by people in Russia. And we support that. I continue to support that call. But, Mr. Speaker, where dialogue must take place for the protection of global security and the sake of the world is on the question of nuclear proliferation. In just 3 days before the attack Madam Deputy Speaker, in just 3 days before the attack on Salisbury, the President Vladimir Putin gave an update boasting of his ability to strike at any part of the planet. We should not be, Madam Deputy Speaker, we should not be about to mark the 50th anniversary of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty in June of this year, with its two key signatories, Russia and the United States, behaving as though it no longer applies to them. It was a Labour government in 1968 that promoted the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. We urgently need the other signatories of that treaty, including the United Kingdom, to take a lead in insisting that Russia, the US and all other nuclear powers return to the negotiating tables and return to the principles that underpinned that very important treaty in 1968. I hope the Prime Minister will take the lead in that global initiative that must happen. It's equally essential.
The right honourable gentleman can choose from whom he wishes to take an intervention. It is his business and no one else's, but it is my business to make sure he will be heard, and he will. Mr. Corbyn.
And I hope, Madam Deputy Speaker, in case the members opposite didn't hear it, that the Prime Minister will take a global lead in that initiative to get everyone back round the table to give teeth and powers to the Non-Proliferation Treaty and what it could develop for the rest of the world. It's equally essential, Madam Deputy Speaker, however unpalatable in the current climate, that we maintain a robust dialogue with Russia on three other issues of crucial geopolitical importance. First, Madam Deputy Speaker, on climate change, where the Russian government has clearly taken the view that if the United States no longer needs to abide by its commitments under the Paris Agreement, then Russia has no need to do so either.
On a point of order, Mr. Francois.
On a point of order, Madam Deputy Speaker, you are, of course, quite right that we are quite right that the Leader of the Opposition can decide to whom he will or will not give way. But how can he become the Prime Minister of this country if he's too frightened to take one single intervention from the benches opposite?
That is certainly not a matter for me. My intent is to make sure that this House and those who are paying attention to the proceedings in this chamber can hear the important speech from the Leader of the Opposition, and now we must have some decorum to allow him to finish. Mr. Corbyn.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The second issue I wanted to raise is that of the nuclear deal with Iran, of which Russia is a signatory and indeed a strong supporter. And at a time when the deal is more under threat than ever from those now in charge of Donald Trump's foreign and security policy, we will need a united front to defend that very important deal with Iran that was promoted by President Obama and others. And whether we like it or not, Russia must be part of that process. The third, I'm not going to give way, and the third issue, Madam Deputy Speaker, is of course, no, I will not give way. And the third, there is of course, Madam Deputy Speaker, the war in Syria. And where Russia stands accused of supporting and committing war crimes in its backing for the Assad regime, in what is now the 7th year of that desperate war, and yet it remains the inescapable truth, there can be no military solution in Syria. But an alternative political solution will have to succeed without Russian agreement, or impossible if you don't get agreement. Including, therefore, must be Iran, Turkey and the United States. All foreign forces will eventually have to be withdrawn to bring about peace in Syria. So again, the international community does need an ongoing dialogue with the Russian government if we're ever to achieve a political solution, a permanent peace for the Syrian people, hundreds of thousands of whom have lost their lives, so many been driven into exile, and so many living in desperate poverty and danger at the present time. Mr. Speaker, it was surprising that any democratic leader saw fit to congratulate Vladimir Putin on his election. And I hope the Prime Minister will also show the same consistency this week by refusing to congratulate President Sisi of Egypt on his sham re-election to office. President Putin's re-election has been preceded in the past year not just by the abuses that we've already discussed, that the Russian state has committed or abetted overseas, but by blatant abuses at home as well. According to Human Rights Watch, the number of individuals punished for violating Russia's regulation on public gatherings was 2.5 times bigger in the first half of 2017 than in the whole of the preceding year. But for all the punishment beatings meted out on student activists, horrendous state-approved homophobia against the LGBT community, for all the intimidation and banning orders against political opponents, one central inescapable fact remains. President Putin will be the Russian president for the next 6 years, and we can't afford to pretend otherwise or wish it away. Of all the facts I've discussed, diffusing tensions on Russia's borders, avoiding accidental conflict, preserving international agreements on climate change and Iran, reaffirming the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, securing a political solution in Syria, and even demanding the protection of human rights in Russia, on all those issues, we will have to engage with that government and maintain what General Pavel from NATO called for. A constructive dialogue, a robust dialogue, wherever, Madam Deputy Speaker, that is required. And one area where that dialogue is immediately required with the Russian government is the protection and safety and security of the thousands of English football fans who will be travelling to the World Cup this summer, as well as the thousands of Arsenal fans travelling to the CSKA Moscow match next month. What arrangements are in place for policing the leg played here, and what advice are there for fans travelling to Russia? I hope the Foreign Secretary will be able to answer those points when he speaks later on this evening. I know there are many in this House, Madam Deputy Speaker, including on the benches behind me, who would...
Order! I hesitate to interrupt the right honourable gentleman, but I could hear something that sounded like a whistle. That will not happen in this chamber. It will not happen. I don't care what it was meant to be. It will not happen in this chamber. Now, we will now have some decorum and allow the right honourable gentleman to finish his speech. Mr. Corbett.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I know there are many in this House, including on the benches behind me, who would prefer the World Cup did not take place at all or was relocated elsewhere. My own view is, at this late stage, such a decision as that would be impossible, and such a gesture from England alone would be pointless. But can I urge the government to do something that could ensure those battles are not lost in the future? Is it not time, as part of the international concern that the incident in Salisbury has caused for the global political community, to urge FIFA, the International Olympic Committee and other global sporting organisations to amend their criteria for awarding major sporting events and demand that bidding countries meet a much higher standard than at present in terms of the protection of human rights and compliance with international law. I believe we're essentially in agreement on many things on the approach that must be taken to Russia in the wake of the Salisbury attack. But as we hold this general debate on Russia, we have strong and deeply held views, rightly expressed in this House, of our collective anger at the Salisbury attack and our strong, united support for a response to this. But we must also remember that we once stood as allies with the Russian people millions of whom died in a mutual struggle for survival against the Nazis during the Second World War. And if we can come through this era of division and hostility, we can, I'm sure, be allies again. If we want to live in a world of peace and security and respect of human rights, then we must continue to hold on to that hope. So let's send a clear message today in support of action to challenge Russia on this, that's robust and hard-hitting and commands the widest possible support. But let's also resolve, Madam Deputy Speaker, that we will keep working in the years ahead for a better, more peaceful future for the safety and security of all of us on this planet.
Tom Tugendhat.
Madam Deputy Speaker, what a pleasure it is to serve under your chairmanship, particularly when we've had such a demonstration of moral relativism seen from these benches, such an apologia in many ways for a regime that has really done nothing to justify the explanations that have been permitted it. Madam Deputy Speaker, may I welcome the clarity that you have brought to this debate when all we have had from some parties is very much the opposite. We've had obfuscation, we've had deception, dissimulation, we have had all the tricks and all the turns that we are used to when we talk about a regime that has institutionalized lies, deception and dishonesty, not, as Churchill put it, as vanguards for the truth, but instead of the truth. These are not attempts to succeed to build a better world, but to destroy one that is trying to serve the people of these islands and our allies and friends. So, Madam Deputy Speaker, I'm privileged to be speaking today about security, and we've heard, and no doubt we will hear more, about how security is built on military hardware, and you will not, quite understandably, hear me resiling from that point. But of course, it's not just built on military hardware. It's not just built on the training teams that even now are defending or helping the Ukrainians to defend themselves against the Russian tanks. Who cares about the overflights over Ukraine when their tanks are actually in Donetsk and in the Donbass? Yeah. It's not just about the British battalion that is even now in Estonia, demonstrating to the Russians that the NATO commitment is real. Those British troops are not just there because they are capable, but they are there to demonstrate that an attack on one is an attack on all. I will take an intervention.
Very grateful for my honourable friend for giving way. Would he agree with me that it's very important to consider the fact that the Leader of the Opposition is on record publicly as stating his belief that NATO should be closed down? And would my honourable friend agree with you that that sends a deep signal of alarm across these benches?
My honourable friend is absolutely right, but of course he's slightly limited in what he said. He should have said, quite accurately, that this sends a deep signal of alarm across this House. Yeah. Because actually this whole House, and I look here even at friends in the Scottish National Party and many on the Labour benches who will remember, of course, that who was it who built NATO?
Yeah, Labour.
It was Clement Attlee. Yeah. Who was it who built the independent nuclear deterrent? It was that Attlee government that recognised then that the United Kingdom had a role to play as a force for good in the world. That was an era when socialism loved Britain and didn't hate it. That was an era when socialism respected the West and didn't hate it. That was an era when socialism stood for something and didn't stand for nothing. I will give way.
In his speech a few moments ago, the Leader of the Opposition made reference to the 1930s and 1940s. Would my honourable friend agree that the one lesson which those unhappy decades teach us is that appeasement doesn't work?
Yeah. My honourable friend is absolutely right, though he will forgive me if I do not join in the comparisons of Russia and Nazism. They are not accurate. Nazism was a hateful ideology that sought the death of millions, that deliberately sought to persecute and murder thousands and hundreds of thousands and millions of many, including Jews and gays and gypsies. We're not dealing with that in today's Russia. We're not dealing with an ideology. We're dealing with a kleptocracy. We're dealing with a simple thieving regime under the leadership of one man who has enriched himself beyond the dreams of Croesus or avarice, who has made sure that even his cellist, a man none of us have ever heard of, has, according to the recent Panama Papers, earned more in his short life and professional career than any musician you have ever heard of. He has over $2 billion in assets, apparently. Yeah. Who can dream of such wealth? Certainly not any of the musicians that we could name. And as a cellist, I should have stuck with those lessons, Madam Deputy Speaker. But we are dealing here with a very, very real state, a very real threat, and that is why I particularly welcome that the Prime Minister herself, my right honourable friend, is here to lead this debate, as she has demonstrated not only through her premiership, but through her time as Home Secretary, how seriously she takes these matters, and I am grateful for her leadership. Very brief.
Very grateful to my honourable friend. Had I had the opportunity to ask the Leader of the Opposition my question in my intervention, I would have asked him whether he supported the continuation of our nuclear deterrent. Does he agree with me that that is absolutely critical and the linchpin of Western security? Yeah. I notice he's looking down.
My honourable friend will not be at all surprised to hear that I am not only very glad that we have maintained our nuclear deterrent, but I voted with favour to renew it, and I was very glad when my right honourable friend, the Prime Minister, had to sadly use the word that she did at the dispatch box when asked if she would use that terrible weapon. The answer has to be yes. Yeah. Not because she wishes to, but because the point of the nuclear deterrent is that it should never be used, and it will only deter if it might be. And so I absolutely agree with my honourable friend. But we are dealing, as I said, with a debate on security here, and we've focused more than I would have chosen, perhaps, on the military aspects of it. And I would like to turn to the diplomatic aspects and pay tribute again to the government for their success, and actually not just the government. There are members of benches on all sides who have used the past 2 weeks to speak to friends and allies across these islands, across this continent, and indeed around the world, to speak up and remind people why it is that we have called for aid at this moment, why it is that we have cited Salisbury and the attacks there as particularly important, and why it is that now is the time for them to stand up. And I remember very clearly a conversation I had only a few days ago with a minister in the French government when the committee was over there, and pointed out to her that she must be under no illusion as she talks about European defence cooperation, that as far as we see it, this is a moment for that defence to be shown real, for that alliance to be proved true, so that we can move forward and build on it. And I'm delighted to say that in our committee that was made up of parties from the Labour Party, from my own party and from the Scottish National Party, there was no divergence on this. There was complete unity, and I was very pleased with the message that we were able to convey, that the British people are united as one on this, whatever our divisions on other things, that this was an attack on the British people and not just on 2 people in a park in Salisbury. But of course, this isn't just about diplomacy either. Overlooked, too often, are our intelligence services. In the security service and the secret intelligence services, in the government communications headquarters, there are people who are working even now, in secret and silence, to keep us safe and to ensure that we are prepared, we are ready, and indeed, we never know about the next attack, because it didn't happen. Yeah. That is so hard to measure, Madam Deputy Speaker, but it is the most essential element of our defence. Without it, we are blind. Without it, we are deaf. Without it, we cannot speak. And like the 3 wise monkeys, we would be left merely as an ornament and not as an actor. And Britain is nothing if not an actor on the world scene. And we have been so, because what we have done is we have played our part in the last 70 years in building the international order that has kept us safe. We have been instrumental, Madam Deputy Speaker, in the post-war era of building the United Nations, an organisation with many flaws, but without which we cannot imagine modern life. We have been instrumental in building NATO, another organisation which asks for many improvements, but still guarantees us to sleep safely in our bed. And we have been absolutely fundamental in writing some of the rules that underpin it too, and including, and I know I don't share the universal support of these benches, the European Convention on Human Rights, which has reflected British law around the continent. And the tragedy, Madam Deputy Speaker, is that you know who has partnered us throughout that journey, well, most of it, is the Russians. The Russians in the 1940s were part of the building of the New World Order. They were part of writing the Universal Declaration on Human Rights. The Soviet diplomats who were there at the UN were not our friends, Madam Deputy Speaker. They were already rivals. But they understood that the rules-based international order was something for all of us. In there was the guarantee that we could all have a future, we could all have a safe idea of where we were going. Now, of course, they challenged us on what that future would be. Their view of the future was actually Soviet despotism. But they still understood that there were rules that had to be applied. What we are seeing today, Madam Deputy Speaker, is the reverse. What we are seeing today is a Russia that does not believe in the rules. In fact, it actively believes in no rules. What it is doing, Madam Deputy Speaker, it is seeking out every tie that binds, every alliance, everything that you hold dear and true, and seeking to break it. And that is why, Madam Deputy Speaker, the repetition of lies by useful idiots, the propagandizing of untruths by adjuncts, is not just a foolish thing to do, Madam Deputy Speaker. It is not just unwise, it is actually and actively harmful. That is why we stay away from Russia Today and Sputnik, not because they show an alternative vision, but because they deliberately undermine the truth. I will give way.
I'm very grateful to the Honourable Gentleman giving way. He's making a very powerful speech, which I fully agree with. Can I say that when we were putting sanctions on Russia after they annexed Crimea, I was privy to information and discussions at the European Commission about how the octopus arms of the Russian state were all over the energy sector across the European Union, and they were using devious means to get their ways. Can I therefore invite him to take on the logic of his speech, that we use not just military but diplomatic means, so that we use energy policy to take the money away which is fueling Mr. Putin's military and intelligence?
The Right Honourable Member knows that I will, of course, agree with him, and that energy policy is absolutely essential to playing our hand properly in this response. And that is why I would urge my German friends here in this House, as I have done so face to face with them, is to not bow to the Russian idea of a pipeline straight to them, because it cuts out, effectively, it removes the diplomatic and the political leverage that countries to the east would otherwise have. And in doing so, actually, it weakens Germany. And it weakens all of us, because we are stronger when we stand together and weaker when we divide ourselves. And that is why we must look at Eastern Europe not as a sphere of influence, not as some do, as an area in which the West has provoked Russia, as though the Ukrainian people are some sort of slave adjunct to the Russian Empire. That is not true. They are free people, as we are free, as any country is free. And they have the right to determine their own future, and energy policy is being used as a weapon against them. But look, I must make a little progress, and if I do, forgive me as I speed through and point to a few of the violations and the lies that have been used, because we've heard cited Crimea, the first time a border has been changed by force since the Second War. We've heard about the occupation of Georgia, and I wish that Her Majesty's government would refer to it as such, because it is one. And we've heard time and again about the attacks in Montenegro, the lies in Berlin, the fraudulent electioneering in France, and possibly even the United States. We have heard again and again and again about these deceptions. And we must now hear much more actively about the response. And my right honourable friend, the Prime Minister, has set out some good starts, and I welcome them. She has set out some very strong ideas, and I welcome them. But what I want to now see is to see them being used. Because my right honourable friend, the Foreign Secretary, said the other day in committee that he was looking forward to seeing the Magnitsky Act used, but it was not a political tool. And of course, technically he's right. It is a legal tool, and therefore for the police. But it will demand our embassy staff, it will demand our intelligence officers and others to put forward the cases so that police know who are those human rights abusers, who are those people who should be caught up in this. And of course it will also require the tools of our diplomats and our intelligence officers so that we know who are those oligarchs who are part of the Russian Kremlin mafia-controlled kleptocracy. We need to know them, we need to identify them, and by doing so, we need to act against them. But there is one last thing, if I may, Madam Deputy Speaker, that I will ask for, and that is that we look at Russian sovereign debt being traded here in London even now. We hear again and again about the importance of London's capital markets, and may I say, they will find few greater supporters than me. But through the London Clearing House, an absolutely essential element of world trade, which underpins in so many ways the debt markets that allow us all to prosper, we have links around the world. And one of those links, Madam Deputy Speaker, is to Russian sovereign debt. And the Russian government, unlike other governments, does not use Russian sovereign debt merely to finance itself. What it does is it's now using it to sanctions bust. They are using their own sovereign debt to refinance and capitalise organisations that have otherwise been banned. And one of them, Madam Deputy Speaker, is VTB Bank. Now, we heard about this a little while ago. This has been reported on, and I must pay tribute to the work of Emil Simpson on this, who has done extraordinarily well to expose so many of these issues. But we can use sovereign debt here, too, as a tool and as a weapon, because we are being fought on every single level in a cross-spectrum battle by an organisation that does not work for the Russian people but feeds off it. It does not work for prosperity but feeds off it. And it does not work for stability but destroys it. So, Madam Deputy Speaker, I welcome what my right honourable friend the Prime Minister has set out, and I look forward to supporting her as she enacts those policies.
Order. As colleagues will see, we have a great many speakers this evening. So after the Leader of the SNP, I'll be imposing a time limit of 8 minutes. Ian Blackford.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The events that took place in Salisbury are a defining moment for our relationship with Russia. Russia, with that state-sponsored act of terrorism, crossed the line. And I think we should be gratified to see the response of our friends and allies across the world that recognise the seriousness and the importance of the events that took place 2 weekends ago. And I was saddened to hear the update from the Prime Minister of the condition of the Skripals. Our thoughts are with them and all those that have been caught up in the terrible events of Salisbury, and they have our best wishes. Madam Deputy Speaker, at a time like this, we need to have cool heads. Cool heads, but delivering a clear message to Russia that the activities that took place 2 weeks ago cannot and will not be tolerated. Russia cannot commit such acts with impunity. And we've seen a coordinated response which has come out from our European and other allies today of the diplomats that are being sent back to Russia, a very clear message to Russia. And we do that by saying to Mr. Putin that this is an opportunity for you to recognise where you are going with the acts that have taken place. And the world is saying, in a unified voice, that you must change. But we are extending the hand of friendship to the people of Russia. There must be change with the way that Russia behaves. Madam Deputy Speaker, we on these benches welcome today's opportunity to debate national security because there remains many unanswered questions and the UK must address its defence weaknesses, including the reckless way in which Scotland's coast has been left vulnerable to Russian encroachment both by submarine and by aircraft. There is no doubt, Madam Deputy Speaker, that Russia has form in ignoring international law and undermining state sovereignty. Russia has also denied that it was behind a chemical attack on Alexander Litvinenko in November 2006. He died after drinking a cup of tea which was laced with radioactive polonium-210. A public inquiry into the killing concluded that the Kremlin probably approved his assassination. And across Europe, we see flagrant disregard for international law. After Ukraine, Georgia, Moldova and Armenia signed association regimes with the EU in 2013. Russia saw these countries' aspirations of closer ties with the EU as a threat to its own influence in the region. This is in addition to Russia's ongoing occupation in Georgia. The conflict has been prolonged and at times heightened as Russia carries out the illegal process known as borderisation. The illegal annexation of Crimea by Russia in March 2014 and the evidence that Russia supported separatist fighters in the east of Ukraine triggered an international crisis. But now we see Russia taking the lead in high-profile cyber warfare, a 21st century threat that the UK government needs to recognise and needs to be able to fully respond to. Madam Deputy Speaker, US intelligence agencies described Russia as the world-leading source of cyber threats in 2015. And the trail of destruction is pretty telling. Russian hackers are accused of the September 2016 attack on German political parties and parliamentarians. In March 2017, they managed to hack into and leak email accounts linked to Macron's presidential campaign. There is an ongoing investigation in the US into the role of Russian interference in the presidential election campaign of 2016. University of Edinburgh research has revealed that more than 400 Russian-run Twitter accounts that had been active in the US election had also been actively posting about Brexit during our own EU referendum. And it was confirmed by the Honourable Member of Beaconsfield in November 2017 that the Intelligence and Security Committee here in the UK would investigate Russian meddling in both the 2016 EU referendum and the 2017 general election. Madam Deputy Speaker, these are serious events that have taken place and they deserve an appropriate response, not only from us, but from our allies. The Russian threat is clear, and Scotland's pivotal place in the High North is a critical point for UK national security. In January 2018, Defence Chief of General Staff Sir Nick Carter warned that the UK is trailing Russia in terms of defence spending and capability. He noted that failure to keep up with Russia will leave the UK exposed, particularly to unorthodox hybrid warfare of the kind practised by Russia and other potentially hostile states. Madam Deputy Speaker, over the past 10 years, Russian air and marine activity off the coast of Scotland has significantly increased. Russian jets are regularly pressing on the Scottish coast. RAF jets were scrambled only in January of this year, whilst Russian submarines are also regularly pressing on the Scottish coast, with recent sightings including those of November 2017. Dr. Andrew Foxall, Director of the Russian Studies Centre at the Henry Jackson Society, noted, Russia's submarines, which lurk off naval bases in Scotland, seek even more sensitive information, the acoustic signature made by the Vanguard submarines. Madam Deputy Speaker, it is an absolute disgrace that there have been no maritime patrol aircraft since the last Nimrod aircraft left service in 2012. Instead, Scotland, a maritime nation in a strategic position, relies on NATO allies deploying maritime patrol aircraft. Madam Deputy Speaker, the UK Government have been well aware of the threat and have completely failed to do anything. Former Defence Secretary, who I can see is sitting in his usual place, told the Defence Committee in October 2017 that there had been an extraordinary increase in Russian submarine activity in the North Atlantic. Sure.
Will he give me a And does he lament the fact that far too often we're having to rely on countries such as Canada, France and Norway to pick up the slack, and that what our NATO allies are concerned about is that for all the projectionism around the world, we aren't even looking after our own backyard?
I thank my honourable friend for that intervention, because that exactly is the point. It has been since 2012 that we have lacked that maritime protection. And it's something that we have to deal with as an absolute priority. We should not be relying on others to provide that maritime surveillance, particularly when we know that Russian aircraft and Russian naval vessels have been coming up to the coast of Scotland. And I call upon the Prime Minister to restate her government's commitment to purchasing all 9 of the promised Poseidon P-8 aircraft to be based in Lossiemouth, and further to give a firm date as to when we can expect these aircraft to be in place. Madam Deputy Speaker, it is critical that the UK redoubles efforts to work with EU partners and the international community in response to Russia's chemical attack in the UK. We on these benches have the concern that the UK is isolating itself through Brexit in a time when working with our European friends is more important than ever. And I call upon the Prime Minister to have the UK remain a member of the EU's Foreign Affairs Council Committee post-Brexit, given the obvious necessity for us to work together on matters of foreign affairs. Madam Deputy Speaker, the SNP have led calls for UK government action in tackling Russian money laundering and strengthening financial sanctions. We welcome the Prime Minister's statement on Wednesday, the 14th of March, and we want to see real action taken on both the Majinski amendments and tackling the use of Scottish limited partnerships as a legal means to facilitate organised crime, money laundering and tax evasion. And let me be clear that we are not against the existence of SLPs that were introduced by statute in 1907. But it's stunningly obvious that the process of registration, the fact that you don't have to pay tax in the United Kingdom, the fact that you don't have to publish accounts, is something that should shame us. We need to correct the fact that, frankly, we've made it too easy, not just for Russians, but other criminals and those wishing to launder money, to do that through the vehicle of SLPs. And we must unite as a House and make it clear that we will work collectively to make sure that we drive out from this country those that want to use the UK to shelter ill-gotten gains.
Will my honourable friend complete?
I will happily
I
give
see some surprise on some faces on the opposite benches. Will my honourable friend agree with me, or my right honourable friend agree with me, that it's very important to appreciate that the regulation of Scottish limited partnerships is a reserved matter for this Parliament to sort out. The Scottish Government has no power to do anything about it, so it's up to this Government.
My honourable friend makes a very, very good point, and I want to appeal to the Government that we are in your hands on this particular matter, and we wish to work with the Government on this. It's a system that has been inherited by us. We all collectively have that responsibility, and I know the Minister wants to rise to his feet, and I'm going to allow him to do that. But I want to ask the Minister if he will commit to make sure that legislation on this matter, post a review that I know that the Government is doing, will allow legislation to come forward in a timely manner so we can go after those that are seeking to launder money through the United Kingdom.
Madam Deputy Speaker, can I just confirm that the Honourable Lady is absolutely right that this is a reserved matter, and also that the Government fully appreciates the seriousness that needs to be understood about this issue and the way in which SLPs are improperly used, as well as needing properly to be preserved for their original purpose. And as the Right Honourable Gentleman knows, we met last week. We are determined to work closely with him to see if we can find a solution to this definite problem.
Can I thank the Minister for that response? And he knows that I commit these benches to work constructively with the Government if the Government does and will bring forward legislation. It's important that we do this as a matter of priority. Madam Deputy Speaker, the SNP will use all means possible to support organisations and communities in Russia who are working to build a better and a more representative democracy. Support for Russia's increasingly isolated civic society is more important than ever before. On these benches, we are proud of the long-standing relations between Scotland and Russia, and I want to pay tribute to the broadcaster Billy Kay, whose BBC Radio Scotland series, The Scots in Russia, so perfectly highlighted the historical roles played by Scottish people in Russia.
I thank my right honourable friend for giving way, and he's making a really powerful speech. And does he agree with me that on the matter of culture and cultural and historic ties between Scotland and Russia, prizes like the Pushkin Prize, which is a literary prize in memory of Alexander Pushkin, whose great-great-granddaughter lives in Scotland and which I won just over 20 years ago and spent time in Russia, are so important, particularly for people on the ground in both our countries who have friendships, ties, that they are not lost and they are not severed?
I am very grateful for that point. It's a very important point that my honourable friend makes, because we need to make sure that we are extending that hand of friendship. Our enemies are not the Russian people. It is the fact that the regime is acting in a way which is irresponsible, that contravenes international law, which is our problem. But the people that are really suffering from the regime in Russia are the ordinary people. And we must do all that we can to strengthen the ties, the bonds that we have over the longer term. And it is regrettable that the Russians have decided to close the offices of the British Council in Moscow. Very much a retrograde step. We need to find a way through this crisis. We need to show to Russia that we're resolute. But in being resolute, it's about getting to a better place. And I can recall at the time of the Cold War that we had the Edinburgh conversations that were established by Professor Ericsson that were so vital in finding a way forward to perestroika. So let's not lose that hope. We have to challenge the wrongdoing which is going on, but we must find a way out of this to normalise our relationships with Russia and the people of Russia. I also welcome my colleague, the Honourable Member for North East Fife, back from a very useful and engaging trip last week to Ukraine. The SNP will continue to work with communities who suffer under the watch of the Kremlin, regardless of where they are. In Russia, Duma laws have systematically tried to stamp out grassroots organisations in Russia. A 2012 Foreign Agents Law made it harder for the country's NGOs to work with foreign donors. Any NGO receiving foreign funding is called a foreign agent. In 2017, there were 89 NGOs on the foreign agents list. The country's discriminatory legislation on LGBT people is used to harass the LGBT community and disrupt pro-LGBT events, while the authorities largely fail to prevent or prosecute homophobic violence. Human Rights Watch have pointed out the current human rights situation in Russia under President Putin is the worst it has been since the fall of the Soviet Union. Madam Deputy Speaker, the United Kingdom Government must redouble its efforts in engaging with NGOs on the ground in Russia, and the SNP will push for the UK to remain part of the EU cultural programme, which will help to that end.
It's Michael Fallon.
Begin, Madam Deputy Speaker, by paying tribute to my right honourable friends. They have met the challenge of Salisbury clearly and firmly and deliberately, and I think the response of the international community today simply underpins the resolution that they have shown in dealing with this crisis. However, the strength of our response, I think, only underlines how our policy towards Russia has not worked. Yes, it was well-intentioned. Yes, it was rational. We wanted to see Russia as a partner and part of the rules-based international system. But it hasn't worked like that, and the actions we've taken have not deterred Russia from repeated misbehaviour. After Georgia came Crimea. There were sanctions. After those sanctions, thousands of Russian troops were deployed in the Donbass, and we had the shooting down of MH17, including the murder of 10 of our own citizens. Our response to the murder of Litvinenko clearly did not deter the attempted murders of Salisbury. So we have to do more, and I note and welcome that the government has reserved the right to deploy other measures beyond the expulsions, measures which must surely include making it more difficult for those close to the presidential administration to do business or raise funds or to buy property here in London. Let me offer the House 4 thoughts, none of them particularly original. First, we have to rise to the challenge of fake news, the ability of sophisticated enemies like Russia to obfuscate what should be clear, to foster conspiracy where none exist, to tell blatant lies when they're pushed into a corner. It is the speed with which Russia is able to do this, using propaganda, social media, the bots, and all the rest of it, that require our response to be so much quicker. We need to deploy faster truth. I appreciate the difficulties of revealing or sharing intelligence, but where we have photographs of a mobile launcher that brought down an aircraft, where we know that an agent as powerful as Novichok could only be developed in the highest grade, most technically advanced state laboratory, then we need to get these facts out far, far more quickly. Second, this was an armed attack on a member of NATO, and under Article 3, not as often quoted in this chamber as Article 5, NATO members agree, and I quote, to maintain and develop their individual and collective capacity to resist armed attack. NATO must now renew its focus on the Russian threat and use the forthcoming summit in July to modernize its decision-making, to enable much more rapid deployment of troops and planes across NATO's internal border, and above all, to beef up its strategic communications, which are so often much less than the sum of their parts. We need a faster and more coherent response from NATO. Third, whether we are Remainers or Brexiteers in this House, we do need to come together now to support the security partnership that the Prime Minister described so well in her Munich speech. And one obvious way to reinforce the security of what continues to be our continent is to help reduce Europe's dependence on Russian gas. And that means, even as we leave the European Union, supporting the fledgling European energy market, and I was delighted to see that reference in the Prime Minister's earlier Mansion House speech. It means helping to increase diversity of supply across our continent, encouraging dual flows and shared coding, promoting more interconnection, and using our technology and our regulatory experience to continue to play a leading part in making the European energy market much more resilient. Finally, Madam Deputy Speaker, we need here to continue to strengthen our defences. Yes, the Prime Minister was right to remind the House that we have a rising defence budget since April 2016. Yes, we do meet the 2% target. But Russia is not spending 2% of its GDP on defence. It's spending over 5% of its GDP on defence. Of course.
Does the former Secretary of State for Defence consider that spending 2% of our GDP on defence is not enough?
That is precisely the point I'm now about to address. Russia is spending 5% on conventional weapons, on nuclear weapons, on cyber, on hybrid, and we now know on a completely illegal chemical weapons programme. Now, the NATO 2%, as my right honourable friend has pointed out, of course, is a minimum and not a ceiling. And I think the House should consider this, and I make this point in not a party political way at all. In the last year of the last century, the Blair government was spending 2.7%. That was before 9/11. That was before Daesh terrorism. It was before Kim had his nuclear weapons. It was before cyber attacks on our own parliament, and it was before Russia became more malignant again. And I don't recall anybody, and I was in the House in 1999, suggesting that our armed forces were overfunded then. So if we want to continue to lead in NATO, on the ground in the Baltics, on the air over the Black Sea, in the North Sea, in the North Atlantic, in anti-submarine warfare, if we want to go on playing our part in the counter-Daesh coalition, if we want to also prop up fragile democracies in Afghanistan, in Ukraine, in Nigeria, if we want to go on contributing to United Nations peacekeeping in sub-Saharan Africa, if we want to maintain a presence in the Gulf and recommit to protect international trade routes in Asia-Pacific, then we have to will the means to do so. And that means, along with the modernisation programme that I know my right honourable friends are now considering, we do now have to set our minds, and this is the answer to my honourable friend, my right honourable friend, we do now have to set our mind to a higher defence target. And I have said publicly that I think we should be committing under the next spending review to meeting at least 2.5% of GDP by the end of this Parliament. If there is one thing that Salisbury has taught us all over again, is that what Russia really understands is weakness. Countries that won't stand up for themselves, won't protect their people, won't protect their values and the freedoms that they enjoy. We've never been such a country. Salisbury should remind us all that we never should be.
Yeah, very nice.
Chris Bryant.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I warmly commend everything that the Right Honourable Member for Sevenoaks has just said, not least his final point in regard to Russia only respecting strength. I think you could make that a bit more personal, in all honesty. I think President Putin only respects strength. And indeed, when President Obama tried to press the reset button with Russia, he got absolutely nothing out of it because President Putin simply took everything he'd got and gave nothing back. And now we see that President Putin seems to be committed to some kind of arms race with the West as well, and indeed announced that just before he calls it a general election, but it's not really a general election in the way that any of us would know. I think we need to set all of this debate in the context of everything else that is true about Putin's Russia now. It's the human rights abuses which are endless. The murder of so many journalists in particular I find deeply offensive, especially when there have been absolutely no attempt to try and pursue those who were responsible. The most famous name is Anna Politkovskaya, but there are many, many others as well. The repeated use of excessive force, whether it's in response to the Beslan siege in the school, or the Moscow theatre siege, or in response to other abuses in Chechnya and political dissidents in Chechnya, Putin's immediate response is excessive violence, and I think that's what we've seen on the streets of Salisbury as well. It's the rigged elections. I will give way to the Honourable Gentleman for Cheltenham.
Gentlemen agree with me that it's not just excessive violence, but it's also excessive dishonesty, and that when we saw the invasion of Ukraine, the instinctive response of the Russian regime was to lie about it, just as they did about MH17, and that is a particular concern.
That's absolutely right. But what angered me more than anything else, in a sense, in relation to Ukraine, was that the whole point of the Budapest Accord was that all those who signed up to it, including Russia and the United Kingdom, were guaranteeing the territorial integrity of Ukraine so that Ukraine would surrender its nuclear weapons. And I suspect that if that hadn't happened, then Putin wouldn't subsequently have gone into Ukraine. And that's precisely the kind of long-term, deliberate pattern of lying and territorial ambition, which I think is characteristic of the man. Let alone the murder of political opponents like Boris Nemtsov, the trials that are in so many instances don't even attempt to pretend to be fair. Yep. I went to Mikhail Khodorkovsky's second trial, but I mean, in addition to which was quite clearly being run by a martinet of a judge who was simply taking orders directly from the Kremlin, but most extraordinarily, the criminal justice system has been used in Russia now to prosecute Sergei Magnitsky after he's dead. I mean, if they couldn't, I mean, it's sometimes I think they want to believe that they're in a satire because that's a means of sort of cooking a snook to the rest of the world, just to point out how much centralised power the Putin regime has. But even more disturbing in a sense for those who care about Russia and her people is the state of the economy. So many people, public sector workers, have had dramatic cuts to their salaries and their pensions in recent years. The average wage has fallen, and the average, the death rate has, people are dying younger now than they used to. That's an extraordinary phenomenon in a modern economy, and an economy which was proclaimed some 10 years ago as going to be one of the brick economies that was going to be the future of the world, growing and all the rest of it, now stagnating because it is, to all intents and purposes, a monogorod. That is to say, an economy that is based on a single industry, namely petrocarbons. It's languishing at 1.2%. Now, we may be only having growth of 1.2%, but for an economy at that that level in the world, they need to be on 5, 6, 7 and 8% if they're not going to completely stagnate as a country and people aren't going to see gross inequalities get worse. What they should have done for the last 10 years is build on their phenomenal human capital, because it's one of the most educated countries in the world, and tackle the corruption. Unfortunately, what they've done is they've built on the corruption and tackle the education. So now you see a massive brain drain of clever Russians leaving that country for elsewhere, and they've fallen further down the transparency list of countries around the world with increasing corruption. And one of the things that I find personally the most bizarre elements of the whole Putin charade is his personal and his regime's utter obsession with homosexuality. For a man who seems to like taking his shirt off more than any other political leader, this does strike me as phenomenally bizarre. I gather he also likes ABBA. What can I say? Madam Deputy Speaker, what should the British response be to this present situation, and not only to this present situation, but actually everything that we've seen over recent years, because this is part of a pattern and should be seen as such? Some say we should tackle the money that is swashing around in Britain, the Russian money, much of which may be dirty. Some say we should adopt a more robust political and defence posture. Personally, I think we need to do both. And I know that there are some who are reluctant to tackle the financial issues, and there are some who are reluctant to tackle the defence issues, but I think we have to do the two in harmony, which is in essence, I think, what the Right Honourable Member for Sevenoaks was saying earlier. Oh, yes, of course.
The defence side of what can be done. Would he back calls from myself, my honourable friend from Western Bartonshire, that we should ask our allies to stop allowing the Russian fleet to refuel in their ports?
Yes, indeed. One of the first things I did when I knew about the incident in Salisbury was I checked with the Spanish ambassador whether Spain is maintaining its posture of refusing to allow Russian boats to refuel in Ceuta, and indeed they are. They've been very strong on this, and they are absolutely resolute with us, as they have been for the last 10 years. So, if I might just deal with some of the financial aspects. I've already referred earlier in the debate when I spoke with when I asked the Prime Minister about the Tier 1 investor visa. I think this has, to all intents and purposes, acted as a kind of magnet for some Russians who want to place their money beyond the grasping hands of others in Russia or in other domains in the United Kingdom. And there have hardly been any questions asked. And I really hope that the government will now do a full review of the Tier 1 investor visa. Secondly, it is true that trusts in this country and in the dependent territories are used as a means of obscuring from public view the real owners of major assets, including land and property. And I think that needs to end. I'm happy for the trust system to remain, because I think in many ways it's a strong element of our financial system. But it needs to be fully transparent, because otherwise it is far too easy for Russians to hide their money. And I just hope that the government will review this matter. It has been asked time and time again whether it will consider making the beneficial ownership of trusts a public register rather than one that is only available to the authorities. And I say that would be valuable because the public and the journalists in this country have done a phenomenal job in recent years in managing to winkle out additional financial information that others might not choose to bother looking at. We also need to bring in full financial transparency in the overseas territories. I know the Minister who's going to be closing agrees with this policy. I just hope that this might be an opportunity to be able to rather twist their arms a little bit further up their backs, because otherwise it's too easy for somebody like Mr Deripaska to buy a property in London, only not really buy it via a trust based in the British Virgin Islands and have it completely obscured from view. And it's an interesting fact, some of us who were taken on the kleptocracy tour of last week, including the Honourable Member for Durham, who's sitting, for Bishop Auckland, sorry, who's sitting on the front bench, will know that one of the interesting facts is that quite often Russians are now buying houses deliberately in the UK for grossly inflated prices as a means of laundering their money via a third party. And I very much hope that the authorities are investigating that. I just want to move on to some of the other elements, the more defence-related elements that I think we need to address. Firstly, we need to have properly sceptical investigation by the police and all the authorities, if necessary the counter-terrorism authorities as well, of the 14 deaths of Russians that have happened in the last few years, which have been suspicious, and not just those in the last couple of weeks. It seems unlikely that anybody would choose not to investigate, but it still seems possible that that may be what has happened. We also need a full spectrum readiness, more counterintelligence and more cyber security. And I think we also have to stand very strong with our NATO allies. And as the Right Honourable Member Sevenoaks said, I think we need to devote more than 2% of our national income to defence. We can see this through, but it's only by being robust and firm and steady state rather than flip-flopping, that we will do so.
Julian Lewis.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Near the end of the Second World War, the Joint Intelligence Subcommittee of the British Chiefs of Staff, as it was then, produced a report entitled Relations with the Russians. From years of experience working with them against the Nazis, the JIC concluded that Russia would respect only strength as the basis for any future relationship. This mirrored Lord Palmerston's view almost a century earlier that, and I quote, "The policy and practice of the Russian government has always been to push forward its encroachments as fast and as far as the apathy or want of firmness of other governments would allow it to go, but always to stop and retire when it met with decided resistance, and then to wait for the next favourable opportunity." Not much has changed. Alexander Litvinenko died in London on the 23rd of November 2006. 4 days later, the BBC News website published an article headed "Russia Law on Killing Extremists," in inverted commas, abroad. It's worth quoting this for the record. A new Russian law adopted earlier in the year formally permits the extrajudicial killings abroad of those Moscow accuses of extremism. In July, the upper chamber of the Russian Parliament, the Federation Council, approved a law which permits the Russian president to use the country's armed forces and special services outside Russia's borders to combat terrorism and extremism. At the same time, amendments to several other laws governing the security services, mass media and communications were adopted. The overall result was to dramatically expand those defined as terrorist or extremist. Along with those seeking to overthrow the Russian government, the term is also applied to, quotes again, those causing mass disturbances, committing hooliganism or acts of vandalism. Much more controversially, the law also defines, quotes, those slandering the individual occupying the post of President of the Russian Federation. So if you insult the President of Russia, you can legally be killed overseas according to this law. The Russian law is very specific, the BBC report concluded, in that it permits the President, alone and apparently without consultation, to take such a decision. So I have to say that at least one honourable member will not be on Vladimir Putin's Christmas card list after his speech today. If anyone had doubts about Russia's responsibility for the Salisbury poisonings, her contemptuous failure to respond to the Prime Minister's 24-hour deadline should swiftly have dispelled them. An innocent regime would have rushed to explain how a nerve agent, which only it produced, could have been acquired and employed by anybody else. We should also have been spared sarcastic suggestions in the Russian media that the United Kingdom is, quote, an unsafe place for traitors to settle, as well as the ludicrous claim that we ourselves were behind the attack. That was a charge straight from the playbook of those who blame the Jews for 9/11 and US intelligence for the Kennedy assassination. Vladimir Putin is a product of the KGB, schooled in the suppression of captive countries, steeped in the culture of communist domination, and filled with regret that the Soviet empire imploded. According to him, its breakup was the greatest disaster of the 20th century, a revealing and curious choice when compared with the millions killed in 2 world wars, in the Russian Civil War, in the forced collectivizations, the mass deportations, and the hell of the Gulag. Until the Bolshevik Revolution, there was some chance of Russia evolving along democratic lines. Then the cancer of Marxism-Leninism gave psychopaths and dictators their ideological excuse to seize total control. Their opponents were denounced as enemies of the people and put or worked to death with no semblance of due process. Now that the ideology has gone, the ruthless mindset remains. Russian leaders no longer claim to be building a workers' paradise, but they still believe that Western capitalists will sell them the rope with which to be hanged. For 40 years from 1949, 2 factors ensured the containment of Russia and the maintenance of peace. One was the deterrent power of Western nuclear weapons, the other was the collective security provided by Article 5 of the North Atlantic Treaty. No longer could an aggressor attack small European states without the Americans immediately entering the war. Yet such preparedness did not come cheaply. In the early 1960s, UK defence spending accounted for 6% of our GDP, the same percentage as welfare. The current welfare budget is 6 times the size of the defence budget. In the mid-1980s, defence constituted 5% of our GDP, the same percentage as education and health. The current education and health budgets are respectively 2.5 and 4 times the size of the defence budget. In the changed strategic situation, this downgrading of defence cannot be allowed to continue. Since 2016, the Defence Committee has been making the case for a defence budget target of 3% of GDP, which is what it used to be in the mid-1990s, even after the cuts following the collapse of the Soviet Empire and the end of the Cold War. The former Defence Secretary has called, and has called again today, for a 2.5% target by the end of this parliamentary term. His successor is squaring up for a battle with the Treasury. It's a fight which has to be won for the safety of us all and for the security of our country.
Well, honourable friend, allow me.
I will.
Does the chairman of the Defence Select Committee think that the way to defeat a modern Russia is the way we defeated the USSR? Reagan crashed their economy because, in effect, there was an arms race between a strong and vibrant American economy and a weak Russian economy. Is that a way forward, does he think?
I would certainly say that it's part of a way forward, and I will use the generous extra minute that I've been given to say that I'm a little concerned about the fact that whilst the government is quite right to recognise that there are new threats as well, there are cyber threats, there are digital threats, and there are intensified propaganda threats, including through the abuse of social media. Whilst that is all true, and whilst that all requires us to devote new resources to meet those new threats, that doesn't mean that the old threats and the old remedies to the old threats have gone away. And I don't like this conflation conflation of national security budgets with defence budgets, because that means that if you add more to the national security budget, you are going to take more away from the defence budget unless you listen to the warnings of the former Defence Secretary, amongst others, that 2% of spending of GDP spending on defence is not enough. But finally, I cannot resist, in the last few seconds, appealing to the Foreign Secretary, who I'm pleased to see back on the front bench to hear my speech, of appealing to him once again to save the BBC monitoring service at Caversham, which we are supposed to have been going to visit, which costs £25 million a year to keep going, which is going to be decimated and absorbed into a wider system which will not be as effective as the dedicated teams that exist at Caversham, because if it was true before that we needed to save it, after all that's happened in recent days, it's even more true now.
Order now. Speaking of generous extra minutes, I'm afraid that after the next speaker, I'll be reducing the time limit to 7 minutes. Martin Doherty-Hughes.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I was glad that the Prime Minister started the debate by making sure that it was articulated that the argument of this Parliament was not with the Russian nation or the diversity of its peoples. Because I'm sure the Foreign Secretary will forgive me. Some of the comments from the front bench at the weekend were unnecessary, I think, in trying to promote dialogue at an extremely difficult time. I think it's important that we must acknowledge, while there is still no definitive proof that the Salisbury attack was carried out by the Russian regime, that there has been no admission of any culpability, nor are we actually likely to receive any. There is no doubt in my mind that it fits a clear pattern of behaviour and threat escalation, not only here in the UK, but in a host of other European states as well, particularly those in the post-Soviet periphery. This is most worrying, especially in the broader geostrategic context, as it's actually coincided with the defence industry modernisation programme in the Russian Federation, which has led many, myself included, to fear that we could be about to enter into a new and unwelcome arms race in Europe, which is in no one's interest. Let us not forget that the first call he had with Vladimir Putin after his inauguration, the new president, or the present president of the United States, called the New START treaty, due to last until 2021, as one of the worst deals signed by the Obama administration, that it favoured Russia. Let's be clear. If New START falls, a whole host of other arms control treaties and agreements begin to unravel. Now, this is, of course, a treaty between, Madam Deputy Speaker, the United States and the Russian Federation, but the consequences of our own security are immense. Yet the evidence would suggest that the UK is in a period of unprecedented weakness in terms of its ability to understand and interpret Russian strategy. Madam Deputy Speaker, whether we like it or not, understanding Russia and its motivations is a fundamental duty of any administration. Yet I would contend that successive governments have made a strategic decision to dismantle infrastructure, to disinvest from skills and people, and to divert funds that have previously been allocated through the FCO, the intelligence services and the Ministry of Defence, which had allowed these agencies to understand the Russian Federation and the old Soviet Union, and help the government to make informed decisions on its policy. I will give one example of how this capability has been systematically dismantled. The Soviet Studies Research Centre was Sandhurst's in-house think tank into Russian military policy. It became the Conflict Studies Research Centre in 1992, but was then moved to the Tri-Service capability and moved to Shrivenham with the resultant loss of capacity in 2005. It then became the Advanced Research and Assessment Branch in 2007. Before it was folded finally in 2010. All that remains from the Army's in-house capability, with its 40-odd years of institutional knowledge, is the Russian Military Studies Archive, still based at Shrivenham, which is struggling itself for long-term funding. Now, with the timeline in mind, let's run over the major milestones in Russian... I will, to the honourable gentleman.
Just on that point, there is one gentleman who mans that centre, one Russian speaker who comes down from Scotland. I see him occasionally. He is still going through the archives, and effectively it is nothing more than a glorified library, which is hugely understaffed, and I think it is a great shame, and I agree with him, that ARAG was unfortunately done away with only a couple of years after. It's one of the most useful reports into the Georgian War. Thank you.
Gentleman for his intervention. I highlight some of the issues that it faces in terms of knowledge of the Russian Federation, and I also hope to be meeting that gentleman very soon myself. But we'll go back to the timeline of the Russian Federation. The last decade or so, the murder of Alexander Litvinenko in 2006, the invasion of Georgia in 2008, Putin's return to power in 2012, the annexation of Crimea in 2014. I cannot help but come to the conclusion that as the need to understand Russia's increasing assertiveness has increased, consecutive governments of every colour have decreased the UK's capability and ability to get to grips with it.
Hear, hear.
Quite simply, the UK's inability to meet the upcoming strategic challenges which Russia poses, the Russian government poses, should cause us all concern. And as we begin to contemplate a new era of increasing turbulence in global arms control, and the prospect of a new arms race looms, frankly, we should all be scared. In this context, the multiple examples of Russian donations to political parties in the UK seem particularly misjudged, and I would hope that we would consider returning them. The ill-gotten gains and the stolen wealth of the Russian people has flowed through this city for far too long. It has entered into the bloodstream of politics. It has purchased property and greased the wheels of the financial sector. That this has happened at the same time that governments have run down its understanding of Russia is not only complacent, it must finally be seen as an abdication for responsibility. We must begin preparations, Madam Deputy Speaker, for the post-Putin era. But who are the potential successors? It is likely that they will be a generation who did not know the Soviet Union, like Putin did. They will probably not come with the KGB baggage he did. It will be a huge potential opening with the possibility of not repeating past mistakes made by both sides, which have led us to this profound point. This type of thinking cannot be done on the cheap, and I fear a diplomatic service consumed by the difficulties of Brexit, that's me being diplomatic, we will be unable to find the resources to do it. Madam Deputy Speaker, let me end by saying that this horrific attack on the UK, carried out against Sergei and Yulia Skripal, may be a new low in our relations with the Russian Federation government. But we must both push back firmly, as the Prime Minister has indicated, and also use it as a wake-up call. The potential for future misunderstanding and miscalculation is great. Let us not use this violence in vain.
Hear, hear, hear.
Mark Francois.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'm grateful to be called in this debate, which is well timed following the appalling and outrageous events in Salisbury barely 3 weeks ago. The question must now be asked, does Russia pose a threat to the national security of the United Kingdom and its allies? I believe that it does, and that we are now entering a new period of Anglo-Russian relations which, if not quite a Cold War, as we had in the last century, is at least what I would call a cool war, characterised by the aggressive actions of a Putin-led government in Moscow and our strained relations with that government as a result. Assessing a threat classically involves an examination of both capabilities and intentions, so perhaps we should best begin by taking a look at the development of Russian military capabilities in recent years. President Putin's rather bellicose State of the Union address just prior to his re-election contained references to new ultra-long-range nuclear cruise missiles, some of them launched by submarine or even underwater drones, he claimed, and thus capable of evading America's limited ballistic missile defences. Analysts currently differ about the existence of such weapons. However, we do know that the Russians have already developed a long-range nuclear-capable cruise missile, the KH-101, which is already being fitted to strategic bomber aircraft of Russian long-range aviation. In addition, the Russian strategic rocket forces deploy around 1,200 warheads in silo-based and road-mobile intercontinental ballistic missiles. The Russians have an active modernisation programme underway for their strategic nuclear forces, which aims to replace all of the old Soviet-era ICBMs by 2020, with many of the new missiles having multiple independently targeted re-entry vehicles or MIRVed warheads. Russia's strategic triad is completed by its ballistic missile submarines, or SSBNs, including 3 new vessels of the Dolgoruki class, armed with the new SSN-32 ballistic missile. All the Russian SLBMs can reach their targets from their home ports, and those in the Northern Fleet are more than capable of reaching the United Kingdom. In recent years, Russia has also made considerable strides in quieting its submarines, especially the new class of Severodvinsk nuclear attack submarines, which are now entering service. In addition, many of Russia's submarines are now armed with a Caliber land attack cruise missile, which is believed to have already been used in the conflict in Syria, a conflict where Russia has targeted civilian hospitals without mercy. Russian submarines have increased the tempo of their operations in recent years and have been frequent visitors to our home waters. And Russian submersibles have also apparently spent considerable time reconnoitring the transatlantic cables which carry so much of our financial services business between Europe and the United States. In addition, last year a Russian surface task group including the aircraft carrier the Admiral Kuznetsov and the battle cruiser Peter the Great sailed through the English Channel en route to Syria. Russia is also upgrading its ground forces. The previous Vice Chief of the Defence Staff, General Sir Richard Barrons, reported that during the invasion of Ukraine in 2014, 2 Ukrainian mechanised infantry battalions were located by a Russian surveillance drone, and using rocket artillery, they were effectively destroyed in under 15 minutes. Russian long-range aviation maintains over 100 nuclear-capable strategic bombers, including the Bear Blackjack and Backfire aircraft. A new 5th-generation fighter, the Su-57, is due to enter service in around 2020, and Russian bomber aircraft now regularly encroach into our airspace and have to be regularly intercepted by our quick reaction alert Typhoons. All of this adds up to a considerable increase in the capability, both in nuclear and convention forces, as part of a 10-year strategic armament programme running from 2011 through to 2020. According to the United States Defence Intelligence Agency, for much of that period Russia spent around 3% of its GDP on defence, but it has increased to 4.5% of GDP last year. So in terms of their capability, the ability of Russia to inflict violence on us and our allies has increased considerably in recent years. Discerning Russian intentions is in many ways more difficult. But we can look at the actions of Russia over the past few years to try and give us some hints of what might lie in their minds in the future. And we can see very clearly that Russia has been prepared to use military power allied to information warfare to achieve its political ambitions on the European landmass. The invasion of Georgia in 2008, when I travelled to Georgia with David Cameron to support the Georgians, the annexation of the Crimea in 2014, effectively the invasion of the eastern Ukraine and the annexation, effectively, of some of those eastern provinces, and then the pressure put on the Baltic states, including a particularly virulent cyber attack on Estonia in 2007. In response to all of this, we certainly need to maintain and upgrade our nuclear deterrent, as approved by an overwhelming vote in this House several years ago. We also need to upgrade our conventional defences, as we did in the 1980s when faced with the threat of the Soviet Union, and bluntly, that means spending the money to do so. It's not often in this place that I agree with the member for Rhondda, but on this one, both he and I are right. The attack on Sergei Skripal and his daughter Yulia seems primarily to have been intended as a signal to other potential Russian defectors to think again. Nevertheless, this still represented a chemical weapons attack on British soil, seriously injuring a police officer and for whom some 30 other UK citizens required at least some medical attention. People who do this are not our friends. As long as Putin remains in government, it seems we have to accept the reality of entering into a cool war with Russia for the foreseeable future. However, working with our NATO allies, we successfully deterred the Soviet Union in the 1980s, and the wall came down. We may now have to do it again.
Carden.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'm pleased to have this opportunity to speak in this debate. I'm from a generation that was born as the Cold War was ending. I'm also from a generation that does not want to see another begin. Let me be clear. It's an outrage that nerve agents have been used on the streets of a British city and in clear contravention of international law. It's appalling that people have been left fighting for their lives, including a policeman, Detective Sergeant Nick Bailey. And I'm sure the whole House will be relieved by the recent news that he's been discharged from hospital and has been able to return to his family. We're lucky that other members of the public who could have been killed or injured as well were not. If the evidence is clear and incontrovertible that the Russian state organised this attack, then the measures taken by the government are commensurate with what any government should do in such circumstances. We need to send a very clear message that banned nerve agents cannot be unleashed in this country or any other without robust consequences. Let me be clear, however, that the often hysterical, ill-informed and plain infantile attacks on my honourable friend, the Leader of the Opposition, for calling on the government to follow due diligence and, in particular, the guidelines set out by the Organisation for the Prevention of Chemical Weapons in such circumstances, has not only been disgraceful, but it's not helped our case in the court of international opinion. I do, however, notice that the government has quietly heeded his advice. Mr. Speaker, to call for due diligence makes absolute sense. My generation is old enough to remember the so-called dodgy dossier that was used to take us into what many believe an illegal war in Iraq. Politicising intelligence and turning it into propaganda is not the sort of activity that a democracy such as ours or any can ever be comfortable with. And my right honourable friend, the Leader of the Opposition, was right then, just as he was right on apartheid, on Chile, on Afghanistan and on Libya. And you'd think some members of this House, who've been far less prescient, would have learned to show a little more humility towards someone who has so often found himself on the right side of history. My question is today, what sort of future will Britain and indeed Europe have with Russia over the longer term? And if it is to be one of ever-growing suspicion and hostility, where could that lead to? And what sort of relationship does President Putin truly want with our country and with Germany, France and the other European countries that are so important for future trade, development and peace? I will.
I was sitting there thinking about what he says about due diligence and due process, and of course he's right. But President Putin presumes that we will do everything we can to ensure that there is proper process in this country, that there's a fair trial and all the rest of the thing, which would not be available to anybody in Russia. That's one of the things that we have to face here. And having gone through the whole Litvinenko process when I was a minister, the worst thing for Marina Litvinenko was that it was impossible to have a proper trial because the Russians simply wouldn't cooperate. Exactly. So we ended up very slowly ending up with a judicial review and inquiry, and we may end up having to do something exactly the same this time. But I just think we need to walk into this with our eyes very, very wide open.
Grateful to my honourable friend, and I don't think I disagree with anything that he says, and I think actually the role that the UK plays as a beacon of light and hope in terms of international law is just as important as any other role that it plays. At some point soon it will be important to have a grown-up debate beginning with some of Russia's closest neighbours who have the most to lose and gain from all of this, and at which point we may also ask the Defence Secretary, who told Vladimir Putin to shut up and go away, if he's matured enough to take part in that debate when the time comes. The policies that were being played out in the aftermath of the collapse of the Soviet Union ultimately failed and have helped contribute to where we are now. And Russia has seldom helped itself either. as those often close to the party. And Russia has seldom helped itself either. Unfortunately, even as those close to the party opposite were helping themselves to some of its oligarchs' rotten rubles, not least to help fund the Conservative Party. At some point, and at some point soon, we're all going to have to step back from the brink and reset relations with Russia. This House can take pride in the work that this country, along with others, has undertaken historically with the United Nations and others in destroying chemical and nerve weapon stocks and bringing about international agreements designed to ensure that they are never used again. The world has rightly been appalled when chemical weapons have been used against civilians in Syria, and why the world stands at one with Britain now over the use of nerve agents here.
I hope the honourable gentleman recognises what happened to America in their relationship with Russia when President Obama pressed the reset button, which is absolutely nothing. President Putin took it, he grabbed it, and he moved on with his own policies. And when the honourable gentleman talks about agreements to end chemical weapons and nerve weapons, we've heard it all before from Russia, and I would plead with him not to take at face value what the Russian state says.
And I certainly wouldn't disagree with him not to take things at face value, but I think as we look into the future, there will be a day when we seek and when the political leader of this country and other European countries seek to press the reset button again, and whether President Putin is there when that happens, we'll see what kind of success we have then. But the message should be clear. We must bolster international law, working in cooperation with our international allies, put human rights at the heart of an ethical foreign policy, support and strengthen the United Nations, and use diplomacy to expand a progressive, rules-based international system. Rules which must apply to the strong as much as the weak. Thank you, Ma'am.
Alex Shaw.
Deputy Speaker, the barbaric attack in Salisbury marks a new low in relations between our nations. That's sad, but it's absolutely right. Chemical weapons are vile because of the appalling suffering they cause, but also their indiscriminate nature. Whoever planted this nerve agent knows fine well that whoever had come to the aid of those people suffering would likely have been very seriously injured. Those could have been completely innocent people, children going about their business. Now, it's a point that's been made already, but we should make it crystal clear our dispute is not with the Russian people. We mourn with them, those who have lost their lives in the shopping centre fire in Kemerovo. We acknowledge the courage and fortitude of the Russian people, particularly during what they refer to as the Great Patriotic War, in which over 20 million people died. And we pay tribute to what I think can fairly be referred to as the genius of the Russian people. This is the country that has produced Pushkin, Solzhenitsyn, Turgenev, Tolstoy, Chekhov, and so many others. We don't besmirch their reputation. Rather, our quarrel is with the Russian regime, a regime that has shown itself unwilling or incapable of complying with the international rule of law, and furthermore has demonstrated a worrying escalation in its behaviour. We know, of course, about Alexander Litvinenko. We know about the downing of MH17, which caused appalling loss of life, particularly amongst Dutch nationals. We know about the invasion of Ukraine, the annexation of Crimea, and plenty more besides. We've heard a little about cyber attacks in Estonia, and now we know highly likely responsible for this attack. But what characterises so much of this is what the Russians themselves refer to as maskirovka, or deception, political and military deception. In plain English, a worrying instinct to lie, to dissemble, to deceive and to disguise. And so it was that the Russian defense minister himself described information as, quote, another type of armed forces. And so it is that a 3-year-old boy was said by Moscow TV to have been crucified in eastern Ukraine for speaking Russian. Well, it soon emerged that that was completely untrue, but it was an eloquent example and a ruthless example of the weaponization of information. Vladimir Putin himself, when a number of soldiers without insignia marched into Crimea, referred to in the West as little green men, he called them, quote, local self-defense units. It was tolerably plain that that was entirely false, not least because he then afterwards gave medals to Russian journalists who had clearly misrepresented the evidence in Crimea. And then, to make matters worse, in our own example, we've heard that the statements that have come from the Russian embassy have been laced with sarcasm, scorn and contempt. And, most bizarrely of all, suggested that somehow the British could be involved. And it is that instinctive recourse to dishonesty which is so concerning. So how should we respond? Well, with cool heads and firm resolve. And I respectfully commend the Prime Minister for her sure-footed and calibrated response. The expulsion of 23 diplomats was absolutely right. But I would just say this, if I may. In responding to Russia, which does show this instinctive willingness to go beyond the international rule of law, we should not abandon our commitment to integrity in the rule of law. Instead, we should redouble our commitment to integrity in the rule of law. So what does that mean? Well, what it means is that when we have in our sights individuals who may, we suggest, have been involved in money laundering, it's for an independent Serious Fraud Office or an independent Crown Prosecution Service to weigh the evidence and to consider fairly whether there is sufficient evidence to prosecute and whether it's in the public interest to do so. And when those charges become before a court, it is for those independent courts, those independent juries, to decide without political interference whether the charge has been made out. And when it comes to a decision about whether things should be on our media, or on our radio and on our television, it should be the independent decision of Ofcom without political interference. It is by restating those principles that we mark ourselves out and apart from the brutal and very often dishonest Russian regime. We should also calibrate our response on the basis of facts and not perception. Russia is, of course, a huge country. It spans 11 time zones, but it's always rather leveraged that geographical size to mask an underlying frailty. We shouldn't forget that its economy is only about 60% the size of the UK's. Its life expectancy of average people in Russia is a full 10 years less than in the UK. Its economy has stagnated for a considerable period of time, and it is only by spending over 5% of its GDP on defence, at a great cost, by the way, to health and education and social care in that country, that it is able to project the image of strength. We in the UK, then, must respond with sanctions, as we've heard. We must respond by redoubling our efforts to go against the dirty money. We should also consider strong defence as well. And I would invite the government to listen very carefully to those suggestions that we need to increase our defence expenditure. But I would just, in the time available to me, invite the government to think very carefully about cyber warfare. And I say this as the member for Cheltenham. But it does seem likely, does it not, that if there is to be an escalation in the future, and let us hope, by the way, that there won't be, that it is in the world of cyber warfare that these sorts of matters could escalate. We need to ensure that we have the best individuals in places like GCHQ ready to defend our country and, if necessary, to exercise our sovereign offensive capability. That does mean resourcing it. It does mean ensuring that we have the resources to attract the brightest and the best. So, in short, in the face of this threat, and with apologies to Theodore Roosevelt, we should speak softly, speak wisely, and carry a big stick.
Ben Bradshaw. Thank you very much, Mr Deputy Speaker. And can I start my remarks by repeating the welcome I gave to the Prime Minister earlier for the efforts the government have undertaken to secure the really very impressive level of solidarity and support from our European friends and others, and any role that personal role that the Foreign Secretary played in that. I think this shows that they certainly have no doubt of Kremlin culpability, and I'm sure they would have been given access to information that most members of this House have not had access to, which has helped them arrive at that conclusion, as long as, of course, the clear evidence from Portland Down and elsewhere. I also welcome very warmly the clear statement by my honourable friend, the Leader of the Opposition, that he accepts Russian culpability, and I do replicate the barracking that he received from some on the opposition benches, most of whom are no longer here. They just popped in to barrack him. They've never been here for debates on Russia before, and they didn't even listen to what he had to say. Deplorable behaviour, Mr Deputy Speaker, and I want to put that on the record. I have been raising my concerns about Russia for many years. Indeed, when I first started raising concerns about 18 months ago about Russian interference in our democracy, I was treated as a bit of an eccentric and a crank and a conspiracy
theorist. I started raising those concerns because of the evidence of what had happened in the United States presidential election, and having expressed those concerns, I found myself to be the recipient of a great deal of very interesting information, some of which has since come out. A great deal more, I have to tell honourable members, is still to come out, which is very, very serious indeed. So I'm going to confine my remarks to my concerns about the Russia propaganda and interference in democracy part of their hybrid war against the West. And it's not just about the direct interference in elections or electoral systems. I want the government to take seriously the attention that is paid by the Kremlin to political parties, to think tanks, and to our educational establishments. First of all, elections. We know from the United States about the extent of Kremlin interference in their presidential election. There's growing evidence here, and I have to commend the chairman of the Digital Culture, Media, Sports Committee for the work he and his committee are doing to look into what happened here in terms of social media. There's the Intelligence and Security Committee. I hope that when it commences its work, it will look into this in even greater detail. I first raised this issue in a question to the Prime Minister in December 2016. And I wonder whether the Foreign Secretary, when he responds, could tell the House what action the government took in response to my raising of those concerns. Did they just leave the matter to the ongoing investigations of the Election Commission, or did they actually make their own inquiries and take up their own responsibilities for ensuring that our electoral systems are safe and secure? Yes, of course I'll give way.
I simply wanted to give him the assurance that it was the intention of the committee to look at the full spectrum of Russian activity.
Good news, and I very much welcome that his committee is doing that. I would also like the Foreign Secretary, if he can, to comment on what the government and its agencies are doing to take down Kremlin operations to influence and infiltrate our political parties. I think the Foreign Secretary has a particular responsibility here to have satisfied himself, for example, that all of those who have donated to his political party and to individual Conservative MPs, including some wealthy Russians here who give the impression of being Putin opponents, are in fact so. And I do hope that he and the agencies that serve under him are working very hard to make sure that he can feel confident in that. I would also invite him to task the agencies to investigate UKIP. I think this is much more serious. We already know that there are close political ties between Farage, who has indeed been named as a person of interest in the Mueller investigation, and that Aaron Banks is also under investigation by the Electoral Commission. And of course, Jim Mellon, the co-founder of Leave.eu, has extensive business background and current investment interests in Russia. So I'd be grateful if the Foreign Secretary could confirm that as part of their investigations to counter criminal operations in this country, they are looking at some of the allegations that have been made around UKIP. And again, I first raised these months and months ago. I also raised concerns 10 months ago, I think it was, about concerns I'd picked up about collusion between the Leave campaign and these other bits of the Leave campaign, like BeLeave, in order to get around our strict electoral spending laws. I also raised at the same time the role of Cambridge Analytica. And we've now had the most incredible, well, they're not incredible, they're extraordinary and shocking revelations this week by the Guardian, New York Times, Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, Channel 4 News and others. And I do hope that the Foreign Secretary can tell us when he responds as to whether they took the concerns I raised back then seriously and what they did about them. And of course the other concern many of us have expressed about the huge donation that was given to the DUP for the Leave campaign, which we're not allowed to know the source of, because the government shockingly didn't make the transparency of political donations in Northern Ireland retrospective, and I hope they will think again on that. The Electoral Commission has asked them to make that decision retrospective. It's always open to them to bring another motion or to this House so that we can do that. We can know and have confidence in the source of that huge donation. Again, a lot of that was spent on this this sort of digital advertising, digital work. Mr. Deputy Speaker, in the United States, they have a very powerful judicial investigation into Russian interference under Special Counsel Mueller. If you compare that with the farce this week of the Information Commissioner trying to get a warrant to search Cambridge Analytica's office, which she finally managed to do late on Friday evening, having been trying all week. This clearly shows that our Electoral Commission, our Independent Information Commissioner, our select committees do not have the powers they need to tackle this problem adequately. I hope that Senator Muller's investigation will come up with more evidence, but I hope that he can reassure the House that all of the various investigations that are going on in Britain into Russian interference are getting the full cooperation and support of all of the government agencies, because I have been told in the months past that that was not the case. I have been reassured by ministers since that it now is happening. I'll be grateful when he comes back and replies to this debate that he can assure the House that anything that the Electoral Commission, the Information Commissioner, the Select Committees ask for, he, the intelligence services and our other agencies are helping them and providing them with. There's a lot more that I could say about this, Mr. Deputy Speaker, including, I wanted to say more about the role of educational institutions, but as long as he takes that on board, I've had a very frustrating time trying to get some sense out of our universities who employed Professor Mifsud, for example, who's disappeared since being exposed by an indictment by Mueller. I just want to say one more thing. On the issue of money, Bill Browder gave 12 other countries the dossiers he's given the British authorities. Those 12 other countries have prosecuted people responsible. Can you just go away and find out why that hasn't happened here, and have a word with his fellow ministers to make sure that they act on the evidence that they're provided with?
Since marrying 34 years ago my half-Russian wife in the Russian Orthodox Cathedral in Gunnersbury, I've made it my business to try and understand Russian culture and Russian people. And they certainly respect strength and standing up to them. It's a bit of a mystery why this murder was carried out in the way it was. I think it was carried out in the way it was to make it quite obvious that Russia had carried out. And it was designed, there's been speculation it was designed around the election. I think it was designed to make absolutely clear that traitors will not be tolerated. And I want to talk a bit about the Russian mindset. When we think of Philby and Maclean, we look at these people with sort of amused contempt. The Russian views traitors with absolute hatred because they have betrayed the motherland. In Russia, and I, of course, pay tribute to the Russian people, Russian culture, Russian literature, in Russia there is a deep sense of victimhood which arises from the Second World War and from their losses, which our losses just pale into insignificance, the losses suffered by the Russian people. And that sense of victimhood is still there. When I was last in the Council of Europe, I did attend the last Russian elections. There's no doubt that they are deeply flawed. They were deeply flawed, they are deeply flawed, but there was no doubt also about the popularity of Mr. Putin. And if he had allowed a fair election, he almost certainly would have been elected, because the ordinary Russian felt that he was restoring some sort of pride to Russia. There's a deep sense of despair and, again, I say victimhood about the way we treated Russia during the 1990s after the collapse of the Soviet Union. Now, I don't for a moment condone, defend, accept the annexation of Crimea, but to the ordinary Russian, they remember that there was an independence referendum in the Ukraine in 1992, voted over 90% for independence. They remember that there was an independence referendum in the Crimea, voted over 90% for independence from Ukraine, that Ukraine has always, in their view, been part of Russia, is largely Russian. They overlook the suffering of the Tatar people. All these facts are very strong in the Russian psyche, and also the attempt to detach Ukraine, which is borderland in Russian, from Mother Russia. I give way to my honourable.
I'm most grateful to my honourable friend for giving way. He makes a series of very important points, and I'm glad he's making them. There are counters to them, which I won't do now, but very briefly, does he believe one of the problems is that the Russians simply can't imagine an independent Ukrainian identity which is separate from Russia, and which is one of the driving factors in this problem?
No, they cannot imagine it because Kiev is the source of the Rus, of the 1,000-year-old history of the Russian Orthodox Church, and Kiev is as much an integral part of Russia as Canterbury is to the Anglican Communion. They cannot understand Ukraine as an independent entity.
I've been getting away